The story of the Polynesians begins not in the vast Pacific Ocean they would later dominate, but in the complex archipelagos of Melanesia, where around 1600 BC a remarkable cultural phenomenon emerged that would fundamentally shape the trajectory of Pacific prehistory. The Lapita culture represents the archaeological signature of the ancestral Polynesian populations, a sophisticated maritime society whose distinctive material culture and settlement patterns provide our clearest window into the origins of one of humanity's most extraordinary seafaring civilizations. The Lapita cultural complex takes its name from the type site discovered in New Caledonia in 1952, though the culture's influence extended across a vast arc of islands from the Bismarck Archipelago through Vanuatu, New Caledonia, Fiji, Tonga and Samoa. What immediately distinguished Lapita sites from earlier archaeological contexts was their distinctive pottery tradition, characterized by intricate geometric designs applied using dentate stamping techniques. These ceramics display a remarkable consistency across thousands of kilometers of ocean, suggesting not merely trade connections, but shared cultural identity and possibly coordinated migration patterns. The Lapita pottery tradition reveals sophisticated artistic sensibilities and technical expertise. The vessels themselves varied considerably in form and function, ranging from large storage jars and cooking pots to smaller serving bowls and specialized ceremonial containers. The decorative motifs applied to these ceramics followed complex geometric patterns that appear to have carried symbolic meaning, possibly relating to clan affiliations, spiritual beliefs, or territorial markers. Archaeological analysis of these designs has revealed regional variations that developed over time, allowing researchers to track the spread of Lapita populations and the evolution of their cultural practices across different island groups. Settlement patterns associated with Lapita sites demonstrate a consistent preference for coastal locations, particularly areas with easy beach access suitable for launching and landing watercraft. These communities typically establish themselves on raised beaches, coral terraces, or small offshore islands that provided natural harbours while offering defensive advantages. The positioning of these settlements reflects the fundamentally maritime orientation of Lapita society, with communities organised around activities requiring direct ocean access rather than inland resource exploitation. Excavations at major Lapita sites have revealed substantial evidence of long-distance exchange networks operating across the Western Pacific. Obsidian sourced from specific volcanic locations in the Bismarck Archipelago has been found at Lapita sites spanning thousands of kilometers, indicating regular voyaging and trade relationships maintained across vast ocean distances. Similarly, shell ornaments, stone tools, and other portable artifacts demonstrate the movement of both raw materials and finished goods throughout the Lapita sphere of influence. The genetic heritage of modern Polynesian populations provides crucial insights into the ancestry of the Lapita peoples and their subsequent descendants. Contemporary genetic studies utilizing both mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome analysis have revealed that Polynesian populations carry a distinctive dual ancestry, reflecting their complex origins in the Western Pacific. Approximately 80% of Polynesian genetic heritage derives from Southeast Asian Austronesian-speaking populations, while the remaining 20% traces to Papuan populations indigenous to New Guinea and its surrounding islands. This genetic signature reflects a process of population mixing that occurred during the formative period of Lapita culture, as expanding Austronesian-speaking populations from island Southeast Asia encountered and intermarried with established Papuan communities in the Bismarck Archipelago and Solomon Islands. The resulting population represented neither a simple replacement of indigenous peoples, nor a wholesale adoption of immigrant cultural practices, but rather a synthesis that combined elements from both ancestral traditions while developing distinctive new characteristics. The Austronesian component of Polynesian ancestry connects Polynesian populations to a vast language family spanning from Madagascar to Easter Island, with ultimate origins in Taiwan around 5,000 years ago. Archaeological evidence suggests that Austronesian-speaking populations began expanding into island Southeast Asia around 4,000 years ago, developing sophisticated maritime technologies and agricultural practices that enabled them to colonize previously uninhabited islands throughout the Indonesian and Philippine archipelagos. When these Austronesian populations reached the western edge of the Pacific around 3,500 years ago, they encountered Papuan-speaking populations who had inhabited New Guinea and nearby islands for over 40,000 years. Rather than displacing these established communities, the archaeological record suggests a period of sustained interaction, intermarriage, and cultural exchange that lasted several centuries. This process of ethnogenesis produced the population that would develop the Lapita cultural complex and eventually expand into remote Oceania. Linguistic evidence strongly supports this model of dual ancestry and cultural synthesis. Proto-Polynesian, the reconstructed common ancestor of all Polynesian languages, clearly belongs to the Austronesian language family and shares fundamental vocabulary and grammatical structures with other Austronesian languages. However, Proto-Polynesian also contains loanwords and structural features that appear to derive from contact with Papuan languages, particularly in domains relating to local flora, fauna, and maritime activities. The development of Proto-Polynesian occurred during the period when Lapita culture was consolidating in the Bismarck Archipelago and Solomon Islands, roughly between 1600 and 1000 BC. During this formative period, the ancestral Polynesian population was developing the linguistic, cultural, and technological foundations that would enable their subsequent expansion across the Pacific. The vocabulary of Proto-Polynesian provides insights into the environmental knowledge, social organization, and material culture of these ancestral communities. Reconstructed Proto-Polynesian terminology reveals a society thoroughly adapted to island environments and maritime activities. The language contains extensive vocabulary relating to ocean conditions, weather patterns, marine life, and navigation techniques. Terms for different types of waves, wind patterns, and sea states demonstrate sophisticated understanding of oceanic phenomena that would prove essential for long-distance voyaging. Similarly, detailed terminology for various species of fish, marine mammals, and seabirds reflects intimate knowledge of Pacific marine ecosystems. The social organization reflected in Proto-Polynesian vocabulary suggests communities organized around kinship groups with complex systems of rank and status differentiation. Terms relating to chieftainship, social hierarchy, and ceremonial activities indicate that ancestral Polynesian societies had developed sophisticated political and religious institutions during their formative period in Melanesia. These organizational principles would later prove crucial for coordinating the large-scale voyaging expeditions necessary for Pacific colonization. Maritime technology represented perhaps the most crucial foundation for Polynesian expansion, and the development of sophisticated watercraft and navigation techniques began during the Lapita period. Archaeological evidence from Lapita sites includes numerous artifacts related to maritime activities, including fish hooks, shell ornaments associated with diving, and tools for watercraft construction and maintenance. While the organic materials used in boat construction rarely preserve in archaeological contexts, the positioning and contents of Lapita settlements leave no doubt about their maritime orientation. The outrigger canoe technology that would become fundamental to Polynesian seafaring appears to have developed during this formative period, though its precise origins remain debated among researchers. Outrigger canoes provide stability and carrying capacity essential for long-distance voyaging, while remaining light enough for beach launching and landing. The basic design involves a main hull connected by crossbeams to one or more lateral floats that prevent capsizing in rough seas. Archaeological evidence suggests that Lapita populations were experimenting with various watercraft designs and construction techniques, gradually developing the sophisticated vessels that would enable Pacific colonization. Adze heads and other woodworking tools found at Lapita sites indicate advanced carpentry skills, while the presence of specialized shell tools suggests techniques for waterproofing and caulking vessel hulls. The consistency of material culture across widely separated lapita sites demonstrates that these communities had already developed watercraft capable of regular inter-island voyaging across hundreds of kilometres of open ocean. Navigation techniques employed by ancestral Polynesian populations built upon knowledge systems that had been developing throughout the Western Pacific for millennia. The ability to navigate accurately across vast ocean distances without instruments required intimate understanding of celestial movements, ocean swells, weather patterns, and biological indicators. During the Lapita period, these knowledge systems were being refined and systematized into the sophisticated navigation traditions that would enable Polynesian expansion. Celestial navigation formed the foundation of Polynesian wayfinding, requiring detailed knowledge of star positions, movements, and seasonal variations. Navigators learned to identify key stars and constellations that could serve as directional guides, while understanding how the apparent movement of celestial bodies throughout the night provided information about course and position. The development of these techniques required generations of accumulated observation and experimentation, with knowledge transmitted through specialized training programs that produced expert navigators. Ocean swell patterns provided another crucial source of navigational information, as experienced navigators could detect the characteristic wave patterns created by distant islands even when land remained below the horizon. These swells, generated by prevailing winds and modified by interaction with island masses, create distinctive signatures that skilled navigators could interpret to determine direction and approximate distance to land. The ability to read these subtle oceanic phenomena required extensive practical experience and represented one of the most sophisticated aspects of Polynesian navigation. Biological indicators also played important roles in Polynesian navigation systems, as various species of seabirds, marine mammals, and fish exhibit predictable behaviours that can indicate proximity to land or specific environmental conditions. Certain seabird species, for example, have limited flight ranges and return to land each evening, providing directional information to navigators within their range. Similarly, the presence of particular fish species or changes in water colour and temperature can indicate proximity to reefs, islands, or specific ocean currents. The integration of these various information sources into coherent navigation systems represented a remarkable intellectual achievement that enabled Polynesian navigators to cross thousands of kilometres of open ocean with remarkable accuracy. The development of these techniques began during the Lapita period, as ancestral Polynesian populations were expanding their range throughout Melanesia and learning to navigate increasingly challenging ocean passages. During this formative period in the Bismarck Archipelago and Solomon Islands, the foundations were being laid for what would become one of humanity's most remarkable expansion episodes. The synthesis of Austronesian and Papuan populations had created a society uniquely adapted to island environments and maritime activities, while the development of sophisticated watercraft and navigation techniques provided the technological means for long-distance voyaging. The emergence of Proto-Polynesian as a distinct language reflected the consolidation of a new cultural identity that combined elements from multiple ancestral traditions while developing innovative solutions to the challenges of Pacific Island life. The accumulated maritime expertise and cultural foundations developed during the Lapita period in Melanesia would soon enable the most significant phase of Pacific colonization, as ancestral Polynesian populations began their eastward expansion into the previously uninhabited islands of remote Oceania. This movement, occurring roughly between 1200 and 900 BC, represented a watershed moment in Pacific prehistory and marked the true emergence of distinctive Polynesian culture as we understand it today. The initial push eastward from the established Lapita settlements in Vanuatu and New Caledonia required navigating increasingly challenging ocean passages to reach the island groups of Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa. Unlike the relatively short inter-island distances that characterized expansion within Melanesia, this eastward movement involved crossing substantial stretches of open ocean, with gaps of 300 to 800 kilometers between major island groups. These voyages demanded not only advanced watercraft and navigation skills, but also careful planning regarding provisions, crew selection, and timing to take advantage of favourable seasonal conditions. Archaeological evidence from the earliest sites in Fiji demonstrates that Lapita populations reached this archipelago around 1200 BC, establishing settlements that maintained clear cultural continuities with their Western predecessors, while beginning to develop distinctive local characteristics. The Fijian islands presented colonizers with environments that differed significantly from those encountered in Melanesia, featuring larger land masses with more diverse topography and different patterns of seasonal rainfall and wind systems. These environmental differences would gradually influence the development of local cultural adaptations, while the fundamental Polynesian cultural template was taking shape. Lapita sites in Fiji show evidence of sophisticated settlement planning and resource management strategies adapted to the specific conditions of these larger, more environmentally diverse islands. Unlike the predominantly coastal orientation of earlier Lapita settlements, Fijian sites demonstrate increasing utilization of inland resources, including exploitation of volcanic soils for agriculture and extraction of stone materials from interior quarries. This expansion of resource utilization patterns reflects the growing confidence and environmental knowledge of Polynesian populations as they adapted to new island environments. The pottery traditions found at early Fijian sites display clear continuities with earlier Lapita ceramics, while beginning to show distinctive regional variations in both decorative motifs and vessel forms. Dentate-stamped pottery continued to be produced, but the geometric patterns became increasingly elaborate and began incorporating new design elements that appear to reflect local cultural innovations. Vessel forms also diversified, with new types of containers appearing that seemed designed for specific local purposes, including specialized food preparation and storage functions adapted to Fijian environmental conditions. From Fiji, Polynesian populations continued their eastward expansion to reach Tonga around 1100 BC and Samoa by approximately 1000 BC. These movements required even more challenging ocean crossings, particularly the voyage from Fiji to Tonga, which involved navigating across roughly 650 kilometres of open ocean with no intermediate islands for rest or reprovisioning. The successful completion of these voyages demonstrates the remarkable sophistication of Polynesian navigation and seamanship by this period. The Tongan archipelago provided colonizing populations with a different set of environmental opportunities and challenges compared to either Melanesia or Fiji. The islands were smaller and more widely scattered, with limited freshwater resources and different patterns of seasonal weather variation. However, the extensive reef systems surrounding many Tongan islands offered rich marine resources, while the volcanic soils of some islands proved excellent for agriculture. These environmental characteristics would strongly influence the development of distinctive Tongan cultural patterns during the centuries following initial colonization. Early archaeological sites in Tonga reveal rapid adaptation to local conditions, with evidence of sophisticated marine resource exploitation and the development of specialized fishing techniques suited to Tongan reef and lagoon environments. Shellfish hooks found at these sites show distinctive local modifications compared to those from earlier Lapita contexts, suggesting experimentation with different fishing strategies adapted to local fish species and marine conditions. Similarly, the remains of fish bones and shellfish from early Tongan sites indicate detailed knowledge of local marine ecosystems and seasonal patterns of resource availability. The expansion to Samoa, completed around 1000 BC, marked the establishment of the easternmost extent of initial Polynesian colonization and represented a crucial milestone in Pacific prehistory. Samoa's position at the eastern edge of the central Pacific would make it a launching point for later expansions into the more remote regions of Polynesia, while its environmental characteristics would contribute significantly to the continuing evolution of Polynesian cultural patterns. Samoan islands offered colonizing populations a combination of high volcanic islands with extensive reef systems, providing both terrestrial and marine resources in abundance. The larger islands featured substantial areas of fertile volcanic soil suitable for intensive agriculture, while the extensive lagoons and reef systems supported diverse marine ecosystems. These favourable environmental conditions enabled the establishment of substantial populations that would play crucial roles in subsequent Polynesian expansion episodes. During this period of initial settlement in Fiji, Tonga and Samoa, the distinctive cultural elements that we recognise as fundamentally Polynesian were consolidating and developing their characteristic forms. The social hierarchies that would become central to Polynesian societies were taking shape, with increasing evidence of status differentiation and specialised leadership roles appearing in the archaeological record. Burial practices from this period show clear distinctions between individuals of different social ranks, with some burials containing elaborate grave goods while others display minimal material accompaniments. The development of Polynesian religious practices and cosmological beliefs accelerated during this formative period, as populations adapted their spiritual traditions to new island environments while maintaining connections with ancestral practices. Archaeological evidence suggests the emergence of specialised ceremonial sites and ritual practices that would become characteristic of later Polynesian cultures. Stone platforms and other ceremonial structures begin appearing in the archaeological record, indicating the development of formalised religious architecture and communal ritual activities. Artistic traditions that would become hallmarks of Polynesian culture were also developing during this period, with distinctive styles of carving, tattooing and textile production emerging in different island groups. While organic materials rarely preserve in archaeological contexts, stone and shell artefacts from this period display sophisticated artistic sensibilities and technical expertise. Carved shell ornaments, stone adzes with decorative elements, and other portable artefacts demonstrate the development of aesthetic traditions that combined practical functionality with artistic expression. The pottery traditions that had characterised Lapita culture began undergoing significant changes during this period, with regional variations becoming increasingly pronounced as populations adapted to local conditions and developed distinctive cultural identities. In some areas, pottery production continued with modifications to traditional Lapita styles, while in others, ceramic traditions were gradually abandoned in favour of alternative container technologies using organic materials that have not survived in the archaeological record. The evolution of watercraft technology during this period reflected both the increasing sophistication of Polynesian maritime capabilities and adaptation to the specific requirements of different island environments. Archaeological evidence suggests experimentation with various hull designs, rigging systems, and construction techniques as populations encountered different ocean conditions and developed specialised vessels for different purposes. While the organic materials used in boat construction rarely preserve, the distribution of stone tools and other artefacts associated with watercraft maintenance provides insights into these technological developments. Navigation systems continue to evolve during this period, with the accumulated knowledge of multiple generations of voyages being systematized into increasingly sophisticated wayfinding traditions. The expansion to Fiji, Tonga and Samoa required navigation across increasingly challenging ocean passages, driving innovation in celestial observation techniques, ocean swell interpretation, and biological indicator recognition. The successful completion of these voyages demonstrates that Polynesian navigators had developed remarkably accurate methods for determining position and course across vast ocean distances. The establishment of regular communication and exchange networks between the newly settled island groups created a foundation for ongoing cultural development and technological innovation. Archaeological evidence indicates that populations in Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa maintained contact with each other and with their ancestral communities in Melanesia through regular voyaging and trade relationships. These connections facilitated the exchange of ideas, technologies, and genetic material that would continue to influence Polynesian cultural evolution. Trade networks established during this period involved the movement of both raw materials and finished goods across substantial ocean distances. Obsidian from sources in Melanesia continued to reach sites in Fiji and Tonga, while shell ornaments and other portable artifacts demonstrate exchange relationships extending across the entire Central Pacific region. These trade networks required sophisticated logistical organisation and represented remarkable achievements in long-distance maritime commerce. The development of specialised craft production during this period reflects both increasing social complexity and the establishment of exchange relationships between different communities. Archaeological evidence suggests the emergence of specialist producers of stone tools, shell ornaments, and other valuable items that were distributed through trade networks spanning multiple island groups. This economic specialization contributed to the development of social hierarchies and political complexity that would characterize later Polynesian societies. Agricultural systems developed during this period combined traditional Polynesian crops with adaptation to local environmental conditions in each island group. The suite of plants that had accompanied Polynesian expansion from Melanesia, including taro, yam, breadfruit and coconut, was supplemented by exploitation of indigenous plant resources and experimentation with new cultivation techniques suited to different soil types and rainfall patterns. These agricultural innovations supported population growth and enabled the establishment of substantial communities throughout the Central Pacific. The period of initial settlement in Fiji, Tonga and Samoa established the cultural and technological foundations that would enable subsequent Polynesian expansion into the far reaches of the Pacific Ocean. The societies that developed in these island groups during the centuries following initial colonization would serve as launching points for voyages to the Marquesas, Society Islands, Hawaii, Easter Island and New Zealand, carrying with them the distinctive cultural traditions and technological capabilities that had been refined during this crucial formative period in the Central Pacific. The sophisticated maritime capabilities that enabled Polynesian expansion across the Pacific represented one of humanity's most remarkable achievements in pre-instrumental navigation and ocean voyaging. By the time Polynesian populations had established themselves in Fiji, Tonga and Samoa, they had developed navigation systems of extraordinary complexity and accuracy that would enable them to traverse thousands of kilometres of open ocean with confidence and precision. These wayfinding traditions represented the culmination of centuries of accumulated knowledge, refined through generations of practical experience and transmitted through rigorous training programs that produced master navigators capable of guiding voyaging expeditions across the vast Pacific. The foundation of Polynesian navigation rested upon detailed observation and interpretation of celestial phenomena, with navigators developing sophisticated star compass systems that divided the horizon into discrete directional sectors marked by the rising and setting positions of specific stars and constellations. These star compasses varied between different island groups and individual navigational schools, but all shared fundamental principles based on the predictable movements of celestial bodies throughout the night and across seasonal cycles. Master navigators memorized the positions of hundreds of stars and their associated directional bearings, creating mental maps of the night sky that could be referenced regardless of the specific time or season of voyaging. The construction of these star compass systems required intimate knowledge of stellar movements and their seasonal variations, with different stars serving as directional guides at different times of the year. Navigators learned to identify not only the major constellations visible in Pacific skies, but also individual stars whose rising and setting positions could provide precise directional bearings. The star Arcturus, known as Hokulea in Hawaiian tradition, served as a particularly important navigational reference, with its rising position marking due east and its setting indicating due west. Similarly, the Southern Cross constellation provided crucial directional information for navigators in the Southern Pacific, with its orientation relative to the horizon indicating both direction and approximate latitude. Beyond simple directional guidance, Polynesian star compass systems incorporated sophisticated understanding of how celestial movements could provide information about a vessel's position and progress during long voyages. Experienced navigators could determine their approximate latitude by observing the angle of specific stars above the horizon, while the timing of stellar risings and settings provided information about longitude and eastward or westward progress. These techniques required not only detailed astronomical knowledge, but also the ability to maintain accurate timekeeping during voyages lasting weeks or months. The interpretation of ocean swell patterns represented another crucial component of Polynesian navigation, requiring navigators to develop extraordinary sensitivity to subtle variations in wave characteristics that could indicate direction, distance, and the presence of land masses beyond the visible horizon. Ocean swells, generated by distant weather systems and modified by their interaction with islands, reefs, and underwater topography, create distinctive patterns that experienced navigators could read like a maritime roadmap. Different types of swells carry different information, with long-period swells generated by distant storms providing directional references, while shorter-period waves reflected off island masses could indicate the presence and approximate bearing of land. Master navigators learned to distinguish between multiple swell systems operating simultaneously, identifying the primary swell direction while detecting secondary patterns created by wave reflection and refraction around island obstacles. The ability to perceive these subtle differences required extraordinary tactile sensitivity, with navigators often lying in the bottom of their vessels to better feel the characteristic motion patterns created by different swell systems. Some navigational traditions developed specialized techniques for swell detection, including the use of small floating devices that could amplify wave motion patterns and make subtle variations more apparent to experienced observers. The interaction between ocean swells and island masses created distinctive interference patterns that could be detected at considerable distances from land, sometimes extending 30 to 50 kilometers beyond the visible horizon. These wave interference patterns, known by various terms in different Polynesian languages, produce characteristic changes in wave height, direction and timing that served as reliable indicators of nearby land. Skilled navigators could not only detect these patterns, but also interpret them to determine the approximate size, distance, and bearing of the landmass responsible for the wave modifications. Cloud formations and atmospheric phenomena provided additional navigational information that Polynesian wayfinders integrated into their comprehensive observation systems. Different types of clouds formed predictable patterns around islands, with cumulus build-ups often developing over land masses during daytime heating cycles. The colour and behaviour of clouds could indicate the presence of lagoons, reefs, or different types of vegetation, while the reflection of sunlight off shallow water or white sand beaches could create distinctive coloration in the undersides of clouds that served as indicators of specific land features. Biological indicators formed another crucial component of Polynesian navigation systems, with experienced navigators maintaining detailed knowledge of the behaviour patterns, flight ranges, and habitat preferences of numerous Pacific seabird species. Different birds provided different types of navigational information, with some species offering reliable directional guidance through their predictable daily movement patterns, while others indicated proximity to specific types of marine environments or land masses. The brown booby, for example, typically flies out from its roosting sites in the morning and returns in the evening, providing directional bearings to land for navigators within its roughly 30-kilometre flight range. Frigate birds served as particularly valuable navigational aids due to their distinctive flight characteristics and their tendency to soar at considerable altitudes where they could be observed from great distances. These birds rarely land on water and must return to land each night, making their evening flight patterns reliable indicators of the direction and approximate distance to roosting sites. Similarly, tropic birds and certain petrel species exhibited predictable behaviours that experienced navigators could interpret to gain information about their position relative to known bird colonies and feeding areas. Marine life patterns also provided navigational information, with different fish species, marine mammals, and other sea creatures exhibiting behaviours that could indicate proximity to specific ocean environments or underwater features. Schools of dolphins often followed predictable routes related to underwater topography and current patterns, while certain fish species congregated around seamounts or other underwater features that could serve as navigational landmarks. The presence of specific types of floating debris, water coloration changes, or temperature variations could also provide clues about current systems, proximity to land, or passage through specific ocean regions. The integration of these multiple information sources into coherent navigation systems required extensive training and practical experience, with navigational knowledge transmitted through specialized educational programs that could span decades of intensive study. The role of master navigator, known by various terms across different Polynesian cultures, including Palu in some Carolinian traditions, Kaha Moana in parts of Polynesia, and other specialized titles, represented one of the most prestigious and demanding positions in Polynesian society. These individuals bore responsibility not only for the successful completion of voyaging expeditions, but also for the preservation and transmission of navigational knowledge to future generations. The training of navigators began in childhood, with the development of fundamental observational skills and environmental awareness that would form the foundation for more advanced techniques. Young students learned to identify stars, observe weather patterns, and recognize the subtle environmental cues that would later become crucial for navigation. This early education emphasized direct sensory experience and the development of acute awareness of natural phenomena, with students spending countless hours observing the sky, ocean, and wildlife under the guidance of experienced instructors. Advanced navigational training involved increasingly complex exercises designed to develop the sophisticated pattern recognition and interpretive skills required for long-distance wayfinding. Students learned to construct and use star compasses, practice swell detection techniques, and develop the ability to integrate multiple information sources into accurate positional assessments. Much of this training took place during actual voyaging expeditions, where students could observe experienced navigators in action, while gradually assuming greater responsibility for navigational decisions. The oral transmission of navigational knowledge required sophisticated mnemonic systems that could preserve detailed technical information across multiple generations without written records. Master navigators developed elaborate charts, stories, and visual imagery that encoded star positions, swell patterns, island locations, and other crucial navigational data in memorable formats. These oral traditions often incorporated mythological narratives, genealogical information, and cultural teachings that served multiple functions while preserving essential technical knowledge. Navigational charts frequently describe the characteristics of specific voyaging routes, including the sequence of stars to follow, expected weather conditions, seasonal variations, and the locations of intermediate islands or navigational landmarks. These charts could extend for hours and contain precise technical information embedded within poetic structures that aided memorization and transmission. The accuracy of this oral preservation system is demonstrated by the fact that traditional navigational knowledge recorded by ethnographers in the 20th century proved remarkably consistent with actual stellar positions and ocean conditions. The construction of Polynesian voyaging vessels represented another crucial aspect of their maritime culture, with different types of watercraft designed for specific purposes ranging from local fishing and inter-island transport to long-distance exploration and colonization expeditions. The basic outrigger canoe design that formed the foundation of Polynesian watercraft technology could be modified and scaled to meet different requirements, from small single-person fishing canoes to massive double-hulled vessels capable of carrying entire communities across thousands of kilometers of open ocean. Single-hulled outrigger canoes, known by various terms including va'a in many Polynesian languages, represented the most common type of watercraft used for everyday maritime activities. These vessels typically ranged from 3 to 12 meters in length and featured a main hull connected to one or more lateral floats by flexible crossbeams that provided stability while maintaining the vessel's ability to flex with ocean swells. The outrigger configuration prevented capsizing in rough seas while keeping the vessel light enough for beach launching and easy manoeuvring in shallow water. The construction of outrigger canoes required sophisticated woodworking techniques and careful selection of materials suited to marine environments. Hull construction typically utilised single large logs hollowed through controlled burning and careful adzing, with the interior shaped to provide optimal hydrodynamic characteristics while maintaining structural strength. The selection of appropriate trees for hull construction required detailed knowledge of wood properties, with different species chosen for their resistance to marine borers, flexibility under stress, and workability with traditional tools. Outrigger floats, known as ame in many Polynesian traditions, were carefully shaped to provide maximum stability while minimising drag and weight. These floats were typically constructed from lighter woods than the main hull, and were designed with specific proportions that balanced stability against speed and manoeuvrability. The crossbeams connecting the hull to the outrigger, called iako, required particular attention to flexibility and strength, as these components absorbed much of the stress generated by ocean swells and wind forces. Double-hulled voyaging canoes represented the pinnacle of Polynesian watercraft technology, with some vessels reaching lengths of 30 metres or more and capable of carrying substantial crews, provisions and cargo across transoceanic distances. These massive vessels, known by terms such as drua in Fijian traditions or pahi in Tahitian usage, consisted of two parallel hulls connected by a substantial platform that provided living space, cargo storage, and working areas for extended voyages. The twin-hull configuration offered exceptional stability and carrying capacity, while maintaining the shallow draft necessary for beach operations. The construction of large double-hulled canoes required coordinated efforts from multiple specialists, and represented major community undertakings that could require months or years to complete. Hull construction followed similar principles to single-hulled vessels, but on a much larger scale, with some hulls requiring the joining of multiple sections to achieve the necessary length and capacity. The platform connecting the two hulls, known as the deck or fighting platform, was constructed using sophisticated lashing techniques that created flexible but strong connections capable of withstanding the enormous stresses generated during ocean voyaging. Sail systems developed for Polynesian vessels demonstrated remarkable efficiency and versatility, with triangular mat sails that could be quickly adjusted to changing wind conditions and easily repaired using materials available on remote islands. These sails, woven from pandanus leaves or other fibrous materials, were designed with specific proportions and flexibility characteristics that provided optimal performance across a range of wind conditions. The rigging systems used to control these sails employed sophisticated arrangements of cordage and mechanical advantage systems that allowed small crews to handle large sails effectively. The claw-shaped sail configuration, characteristic of many Polynesian vessels, provided exceptional windward sailing ability, allowing these craft to sail closer to the wind than many European vessels of comparable size. This capability proved crucial for long-distance voyaging, as it enabled navigators to take advantage of seasonal wind patterns while maintaining the ability to make progress against unfavourable winds when necessary. The flexibility of Polynesian sail systems also allowed rapid reconfiguration for different sailing conditions, with experienced crews capable of adjusting sail area and shape to optimise performance as conditions changed. Steering systems for large voyaging canoes employed sophisticated arrangements of steering paddles and rudders that provided precise control during extended ocean passages. Master navigators typically maintained personal control of steering during critical phases of voyaging, using their intimate knowledge of vessel handling characteristics to maintain course accuracy and optimize sailing performance. The design of steering systems reflected deep understanding of hydrodynamic principles, with paddle shapes and positioning carefully optimized to provide maximum control authority with minimum effort. The cultural and spiritual dimensions of Polynesian ocean voyaging extended far beyond the technical aspects of navigation and vessel construction, encompassing complex systems of rituals, taboos, and mythological beliefs that governed all aspects of maritime activities. Ocean voyaging was understood not merely as a practical activity, but as a sacred undertaking that required proper spiritual preparation and ongoing attention to supernatural forces that could influence the success or failure of expeditions. Preparation for major voyaging expeditions involved elaborate ritual sequences designed to ensure favourable conditions and protection from supernatural dangers. These ceremonies typically included offerings to sea deities, purification rituals for crew members and vessels, and divination practices intended to determine auspicious timing for departure. The specific details of these rituals varied between different island groups and cultural traditions, but all shared recognition of the ocean as a sacred realm inhabited by powerful spiritual forces that demanded respect and proper propitiation. Taboo systems governing voyaging activities established strict behavioural codes that regulated conduct during ocean passages and defined the relationships between crew members, navigational specialists, and spiritual authorities. These restrictions often included prohibitions on specific foods, sexual activities, and social interactions that were believed to influence supernatural forces affecting voyaging success. Violations of these taboos were considered extremely serious offences that could endanger entire expeditions through supernatural retribution. The deification of exceptional navigators and the incorporation of voyaging achievements into mythological narratives reflected the profound cultural significance of maritime activities in Polynesian societies. Legendary navigators became cultural heroes whose exploits were celebrated in oral traditions that preserved both historical information and spiritual teachings about the relationship between humans and the ocean environment. These mythological narratives often described supernatural abilities attributed to masked navigators, including the power to communicate with sea creatures, control weather patterns, and navigate through spiritual as well as physical dimensions. The mastery of oceanic navigation and sophisticated maritime technology that had developed during the initial settlement of Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa provided the foundation for the next crucial phase of Polynesian expansion, as populations began pushing eastward into the more remote reaches of the Pacific Ocean. This second wave of colonisation, spanning roughly from 300 to 600 AD, would establish Polynesian presence in some of the most isolated archipelagos on Earth, and demonstrate the extraordinary capabilities of these oceanic peoples to adapt and thrive in environments separated by thousands of kilometres of open ocean. The Marquesas Islands emerged as the first major target of this renewed eastward expansion, representing a voyage of approximately 2,000 kilometres from the nearest established Polynesian settlements in the Central Pacific. This journey required navigators to cross vast stretches of ocean with no intermediate islands for rest or reprovisioning, demanding unprecedented levels of planning, preparation, and navigational precision. Archaeological evidence suggests that the first successful colonisation of the Marquesas occurred around 300 AD, though earlier unsuccessful attempts may have preceded the establishment of permanent settlements. The environmental challenges presented by the Marquesas differed significantly from those encountered in earlier phases of Polynesian expansion. These high volcanic islands featured dramatic topography with steep-sided valleys separated by razor-sharp ridges, creating isolated pockets of habitable land surrounded by precipitous terrain. The island's position in the southeastern trade zone subjected them to different rainfall patterns compared to the Central Pacific, with marked wet and dry seasons that required new agricultural strategies and water management techniques. The successful colonisation of the Marquesas required careful selection of initial settlement sites that could provide access to both marine and terrestrial resources, while offering protection from seasonal weather extremes. Archaeological excavations at early Marquesan sites reveal sophisticated settlement planning that took advantage of sheltered valleys with reliable freshwater sources and favourable microclimates for agriculture. These early communities established themselves in locations that provided easy access to productive reef systems, while maintaining connections to inland resources through carefully planned trail networks. The material culture recovered from the earliest Marquesan sites demonstrates both continuity with central Polynesian traditions and rapid adaptation to local conditions. Stone tool assemblages show modifications in adze forms and manufacturing techniques suited to working with local basalt and other volcanic rocks that differed in their knapping properties from materials available in Western Polynesia. Fishing equipment displays innovations adapted to Marquesan marine environments, including specialised hooks designed for catching the deep-water fish species that inhabited the steep underwater slopes surrounding these volcanic islands. The pottery traditions that had characterised earlier phases of Polynesian expansion underwent significant changes in the Marquesas, with ceramic production eventually disappearing entirely as populations developed alternative container technologies using organic materials. This transition reflects both the practical challenges of obtaining suitable clay materials in volcanic environments and the development of sophisticated techniques for manufacturing containers from gourds, coconut shells, and other plant materials that proved more suitable for the nomadic lifestyle required by ongoing Pacific exploration. The establishment of sustainable populations in the Marquesas required the successful introduction and cultivation of the essential crop plants that formed the foundation of Polynesian agricultural systems. Taro, the most important staple crop throughout Polynesia, required careful adaptation to Marquesan growing conditions, with colonists developing new cultivation techniques suited to the island's steep terrain and variable rainfall patterns. Archaeological evidence from early agricultural sites shows the construction of sophisticated terracing systems that maximised arable land while preventing soil erosion on steep slopes. Breadfruit trees, another crucial component of Polynesian agriculture, were successfully established in the Marquesas despite the challenges of transporting living plant material across thousands of kilometres of ocean. The cultivation of breadfruit required long-term planning and patience, as these trees take several years to reach productive maturity, demanding that colonising populations maintain stable settlements long enough for their agricultural investments to yield returns. The successful establishment of breadfruit groves in the Marquesas demonstrates the confidence and commitment of these early colonists to permanent settlement. Coconut palms proved particularly well adapted to Marquesan conditions, thriving in the sandy coastal soils and providing multiple essential resources including food, water, fibre, and construction materials. The establishment of coconut groves along Marquesan shorelines created sustainable sources of provisions for ongoing voyaging expeditions, while providing the raw materials necessary for maintaining watercraft and sailing equipment. Archaeological evidence suggests that coconut cultivation was prioritised in areas with easy beach access, reflecting the ongoing importance of maritime activities in Marquesan society. The introduction of domestic animals to the Marquesas presented unique challenges related to the long ocean passages required to transport living creatures to these remote islands. Pigs, dogs, and chickens all required careful attention during voyages lasting several weeks, with colonising expeditions needing to provide adequate food, water, and shelter for these animals while maintaining the human crew and navigating across vast ocean distances. The successful establishment of breeding populations of all three species in the Marquesas demonstrates remarkable logistical capabilities and forward planning by Polynesian colonists. Pigs proved particularly valuable in the Marquesan environment, providing both protein and materials for tool manufacture, while serving important ceremonial functions in the developing social hierarchies of these island communities. Archaeological evidence from early Marquesan sites includes pig bones, showing evidence of systematic butchering and consumption, along with pig tusks that were modified for use as cutting tools and ceremonial ornaments. The maintenance of pig populations required the development of feeding strategies that utilised local plant resources while avoiding competition with human food supplies. Dogs served multiple functions in Marquesan society, providing companionship, assistance in hunting, and eventually becoming an important protein source during periods of resource scarcity. The archaeological record shows evidence of dog burials that suggest these animals held significant cultural importance beyond their practical utility, with some individuals receiving elaborate interment that indicates their integration into Marquesan's spiritual and social systems. The genetic analysis of ancient dog remains from the Marquesas has provided insights into the origins and migration routes of Polynesian colonizing expeditions. Chickens adapted particularly well to Marquesan conditions, establishing feral populations that provided sustainable sources of both eggs and meat while requiring minimal human intervention. Archaeological sites contain abundant chicken bones and eggshell fragments that demonstrate the successful integration of these birds into local food systems. The presence of chicken remains in ceremonial contexts suggests that these birds also played roles in ritual activities and social exchanges that helped maintain community cohesion during the challenging early phases of settlement. The development of distinct regional variations in Polynesian culture accelerated during the Marquesan settlement period as populations adapted their social, religious, and artistic traditions to new environmental conditions while maintaining essential cultural connections with their ancestral communities. The isolation imposed by vast ocean distances encouraged local innovation, while the shared challenges of island colonization reinforced core Polynesian values and practices that had proven successful in previous expansion episodes. Marquesan artistic traditions developed distinctive characteristics that reflected both the island's unique environmental features and the cultural creativity of populations adapting to new circumstances. Stone carving traditions flourished in the Marquesas, taking advantage of the high-quality volcanic stone available throughout the islands to create elaborate ceremonial sculptures, architectural elements, and portable artworks. These stone carvings display sophisticated technical skills and artistic sensibilities that built upon earlier Polynesian traditions while developing innovative stylistic elements unique to Marquesan culture. The tattooing traditions that would become one of the most recognisable aspects of Polynesian culture reached extraordinary levels of sophistication in the Marquesas, with complex geometric and figurative designs that conveyed information about social status, genealogical connections, and spiritual beliefs. Archaeological evidence for tattooing practices includes specialised bone and shell implements used for creating these elaborate body modifications, along with pigment preparation materials that demonstrate the technical complexity of Marquesan tattooing traditions. Religious and ceremonial practices in the Marquesas incorporated both traditional Polynesian elements and innovations developed in response to local conditions and social needs. The construction of elaborate stone ceremonial platforms, known as mea in Marquesan terminology, provided focal points for community rituals and demonstrated the organisational capabilities of these island societies. These structures required coordinated labour from multiple family groups and represented significant investments of time and resources that reflected the growing social complexity of Marquesan communities. The success of Marquesan colonisation provided the foundation for subsequent expansion into other remote Pacific archipelagos, as these islands became launching points for voyages to the Society Islands, Cook Islands, and eventually the most distant corners of the Polynesian Triangle. The navigational knowledge gained through the successful voyage to the Marquesas, combined with the environmental adaptation strategies developed during initial settlement, created a template for colonising other remote island groups scattered across the eastern Pacific. The Society Islands, located approximately 1,500 kilometres southwest of the Marquesas, represented the next major target for Polynesian expansion during this period. The voyage from the Marquesas to the Society Islands required navigators to sail against prevailing wind patterns for much of the journey, demonstrating the sophisticated sailing capabilities of Polynesian watercraft and the navigational skills required to maintain accurate courses across such distances. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Society Islands were successfully colonised around 600 AD, establishing populations that would eventually become some of the most culturally influential in all of Polynesia. The environmental conditions encountered in the Society Islands differed markedly from those in the Marquesas, featuring lower elevations, more extensive reef systems, and different patterns of seasonal rainfall and wind exposure. These environmental differences required colonising populations to modify their agricultural strategies, settlement patterns, and resource exploitation techniques while maintaining the essential cultural and technological foundations that had enabled successful Pacific colonization. The Cook Islands, scattered across a vast area of the Central Pacific, presented colonizing populations with a diverse array of environmental challenges and opportunities. Some islands in this group featured high volcanic peaks with abundant fresh water and fertile soils, while others consisted of low coral atolls with limited terrestrial resources but extensive marine ecosystems. The successful colonization of this diverse archipelago required flexible adaptation strategies and sophisticated understanding of different island environments. The establishment of Polynesian populations throughout these Central Pacific archipelagos during the first millennium AD created a network of interconnected communities that maintained contact through regular voyaging and exchange relationships. Archaeological evidence demonstrates ongoing interaction between different island groups, with trade goods, technological innovations and cultural practices spreading throughout the region through these maritime connections. Obsidian from specific volcanic sources has been found at sites hundreds of kilometres from its origin, while distinctive artefact styles show evidence of diffusion across multiple island groups. The development of specialised craft production during this period reflects both the growing social complexity of Polynesian societies and the establishment of exchange networks that could support economic specialisation. Different island groups began developing reputations for particular types of products, with some communities specialising in the production of high-quality stone tools, others focusing on shell ornaments or textile production, and still others becoming known for their expertise in watercraft construction or navigation. The agricultural systems that developed throughout these newly colonised archipelagos demonstrated remarkable innovation in adapting traditional Polynesian crops to diverse environmental conditions. Taro cultivation techniques were modified to suit different soil types, rainfall patterns, and topographic conditions, with some communities developing sophisticated irrigation systems, while others relied on rainfall agriculture or specialised dryland farming techniques. These agricultural innovations supported population growth and enabled the establishment of substantial communities throughout the region. The social and political systems that emerged in these island communities during the centuries following initial colonization reflected both traditional Polynesian organizational principles and adaptations to local conditions and resource availability. Chiefly hierarchies developed that combined hereditary status with demonstrated competence in essential skills such as navigation, warfare, and resource management. These leadership systems provided the organizational framework necessary for coordinating complex activities such as long-distance voyaging, large-scale construction projects, and inter-island trade relationships. The established networks of interconnected Polynesian communities scattered across the Central Pacific had created a foundation of navigational knowledge, technological expertise, and cultural confidence that would enable the most audacious phase of Pacific colonization. Between 800 and 1300 AD, Polynesian voyagers would push the boundaries of human exploration to their absolute limits, reaching islands so remote and challenging that their successful colonization represents perhaps the most remarkable achievement in the history of human maritime expansion. The settlement of Hawaii, occurring sometime between 300 and 800 AD, marked one of the earliest ventures into these extreme frontiers of the Pacific. The voyage from the Marquesas to the Hawaiian archipelago required navigators to traverse approximately 4,000 kilometers of open ocean, crossing the equator and entering the northern Pacific, where different star patterns, wind systems, and ocean currents created entirely new navigational challenges. This journey demanded not only exceptional skill in traditional Polynesian wayfinding techniques, but also the ability to adapt these methods to unfamiliar celestial and oceanic conditions. The Hawaiian Islands presented colonizing populations with environmental conditions unlike any previously encountered during Polynesian expansion. These massive volcanic peaks, rising over 4,000 meters above sea level, created dramatic variations in climate and rainfall patterns that changed dramatically with elevation and geographic orientation. The windward sides of the major islands received abundant rainfall that supported lush tropical vegetation, while leeward areas remained relatively dry and required different agricultural strategies. This environmental diversity within individual islands provided both opportunities and challenges that would fundamentally shape Hawaiian cultural development. The successful establishment of sustainable populations in Hawaii required colonists to develop entirely new approaches to resource management and agricultural production. The introduction of traditional Polynesian crops proceeded successfully in suitable microclimates, but the vast scale and environmental diversity of the Hawaiian Islands enabled experimentation with cultivation techniques on a scale impossible in smaller island environments. Taro cultivation expanded beyond traditional wetland systems to include extensive dryland varieties adapted to different rainfall zones and soil types throughout the archipelago. The development of sophisticated irrigation systems in Hawaii represented one of the most significant agricultural innovations in Polynesian history. Hawaiian communities constructed elaborate networks of stone-lined channels, terraces, and retention ponds that captured and distributed water from mountain streams across extensive cultivation areas. These irrigation systems, known as auwai, required coordinated labour from multiple communities and demonstrated remarkable engineering capabilities that transformed previously unusable land into highly productive agricultural areas. Sweet potato cultivation, which may have been introduced to Hawaii through contact with South American populations, or developed independently from indigenous Hawaiian plant resources, became a crucial component of Hawaiian agricultural systems. This hardy crop thrived in the drier leeward areas of the islands, where traditional Polynesian staples struggled, enabling Hawaiian populations to utilize previously marginal lands while providing dietary diversity that supported larger population densities than had been achieved elsewhere in Polynesia. The isolation of the Hawaiian Islands, separated by thousands of kilometers from the nearest Polynesian populations, encouraged the development of distinctive cultural innovations while preserving essential elements of traditional Polynesian society. Hawaiian religious practices evolved to incorporate worship of volcanic deities associated with the dramatic geological processes that continued to shape the islands. Pele, the volcano goddess, became central to Hawaiian spiritual beliefs, with elaborate ritual cycles developed around volcanic activity and the ongoing creation of new land through lava flows. The construction of massive stone temples known as heiau represented one of the most distinctive aspects of Hawaiian religious architecture. These ceremonial complexes, some covering several acres and incorporating walls over 3 meters high, required enormous investments of labour and demonstrated the organisational capabilities of Hawaiian chiefly societies. The largest heiau incorporated sophisticated astronomical alignments that connected Hawaiian religious practices with detailed observation of celestial phenomena, reflecting the continued importance of navigational knowledge in Hawaiian culture. Hawaiian social hierarchies developed along traditional Polynesian lines, but achieved levels of complexity and stratification that exceeded those found in smaller island environments. The abundance of resources available across the diverse Hawaiian landscape enabled the support of specialized craft producers, religious practitioners, and political administrators in numbers impossible in more resource-constrained environments. The development of the kapu system, an elaborate code of religious and social prohibitions, provided the regulatory framework necessary for managing increasingly complex Hawaiian societies. The evolution of Hawaiian warfare reflected both traditional Polynesian patterns and adaptations to the unique conditions of large island environments. The construction of fortified settlements in defensible locations throughout the islands demonstrates the development of sophisticated military strategies adapted to Hawaiian topography. Stone-walled enclosures built on ridgelines and cliff faces provided protection for communities while controlling access to crucial resources such as freshwater springs and agricultural areas. Hawaiian watercraft technology diverged significantly from traditional Polynesian designs, with local innovations reflecting adaptation to the specific conditions of inter-island voyaging within the Hawaiian archipelago. The development of large single-hulled canoes capable of carrying substantial crews and cargo across the channels between Hawaiian islands represented a departure from the outrigger designs that had characterized earlier Polynesian expansion. These vessels, some exceeding 30 meters in length, incorporated sophisticated construction techniques that utilized the large koa trees available in Hawaiian forests. The settlement of Rapa Nui, known today as Easter Island, represented perhaps the most extraordinary achievement in the entire history of human oceanic exploration. Located approximately 3,700 kilometers from the nearest Polynesian populations in the Marquesas, and over 4,000 kilometers from the South American coast, Rapa Nui stands as the most isolated inhabited landmass on Earth. The successful colonization of this remote speck of land, achieved around 1200 to 1300 AD, required navigational precision and expedition planning that pushed Polynesian maritime capabilities to their absolute limits. The voyage to Rapa Nui demanded navigators to maintain accurate courses across vast stretches of ocean, with no intermediate islands for course correction or reprovisioning. The island itself, measuring only 164 square kilometers, presented an extremely small target that required extraordinary navigational accuracy to locate. The successful completion of this voyage demonstrates that Polynesian navigators had achieved levels of precision in celestial navigation and dead reckoning that rival modern instrumental methods. The environmental conditions encountered on Rapa Nui differ dramatically from those found elsewhere in Polynesia, presenting colonizing populations with unprecedented challenges that would test their adaptability to its limits. The island's subtropical location subjected it to cooler temperatures than experienced elsewhere in tropical Polynesia, while its isolation from major weather systems created relatively stable but limited rainfall patterns. The absence of coral reefs around the island eliminated the rich marine resources that had supported Polynesian populations throughout their Pacific expansion. The terrestrial environment of Rapa Nui consisted primarily of grasslands and scattered groves of palm trees, with limited freshwater resources concentrated in a few crater lakes and seasonal streams. The volcanic soils proved fertile for agriculture, but the island's small size and isolation meant that colonizing populations had to achieve complete self-sufficiency in all essential resources. The successful establishment of sustainable communities under these challenging conditions required remarkable innovation and careful resource management. The introduction of traditional Polynesian crops to Rapa Nui met with mixed success, as the island's climate and soil conditions proved unsuitable for some species, while others adapted successfully. Sweet potato cultivation became particularly important on Rapa Nui, with this hardy crop providing the foundation for sustainable agriculture in the island's challenging environment. The development of sophisticated cultivation techniques, including the construction of stone mulch gardens that conserved soil moisture and protected plants from wind damage, demonstrated the innovative capabilities of Rapa Nui populations. The famous moai statues that have made Rapa Nui internationally renowned represent one of the most distinctive cultural developments in Polynesian history. These massive stone sculptures, numbering nearly 1,000 across the island, were carved from volcanic tuff quarried at Ranararaku crater and transported to ceremonial platforms throughout the island. The construction of these monuments required sophisticated stoneworking techniques, complex logistical planning for transportation, and coordinated labour from substantial populations. The moai construction process reveals remarkable technical capabilities that developed in response to Rapa Nui's unique conditions. The statues were carved using traditional Polynesian stone tools, but the scale and precision of the work exceeded anything achieved elsewhere in Polynesia. The transportation of completed moai from their quarry sites to their final locations across the island required innovative engineering solutions, with recent experimental archaeology suggesting that the statues may have been walked upright using coordinated rope teams rather than rolled on logs as previously assumed. The ceremonial platforms, known as ahu, that supported the moai incorporated sophisticated construction techniques that demonstrate advanced understanding of engineering principles. These stone structures, some extending over 100 metres in length, were built using precisely fitted blocks weighing several tons each. The construction required careful planning to ensure structural stability, while creating the precise orientations necessary for the astronomical alignments that govern many ahu positions. The settlement of Aotearoa, known today as New Zealand, represented the final major expansion of Polynesian colonisation and perhaps the most challenging environmental adaptation in the entire history of Pacific settlement. The voyage from central Polynesia to New Zealand, accomplished around 1250 to 1300 AD, required navigators to sail over 2,000 kilometres southward into temperate waters where completely different weather patterns, ocean conditions and celestial phenomena created unprecedented navigational challenges. The Maori ancestors who accomplished this remarkable voyage had to adapt their traditional tropical navigation techniques to southern Pacific conditions, where different stars served as directional guides and seasonal variations in weather patterns differed dramatically from those experienced elsewhere in Polynesia. The Southern Cross constellation, barely visible from most Polynesian islands, became a crucial navigational reference in southern waters, while the absence of familiar northern stars required navigators to develop entirely new stellar compass systems. The environmental conditions encountered in Aotearoa differed more dramatically from traditional Polynesian island environments than any previously colonised territory. The temperate climate featured distinct seasons with cold winters that required entirely new approaches to shelter construction, clothing and food preservation. The absence of coral reefs eliminated the marine resources that had supported Polynesian populations throughout their Pacific expansion, while the presence of extensive temperate forests provided new opportunities for resource exploitation. The landmasses of Aotearoa, consisting of two large islands totalling over 268,000 square kilometres, dwarfed any territory previously encountered by Polynesian colonists. This vast area provided unprecedented opportunities for territorial expansion and resource exploitation, but also presented challenges in terms of exploration, communication, and social organisation that required fundamental adaptations to traditional Polynesian settlement patterns. The introduction of traditional Polynesian crops to Aotearoa met with limited success due to the temperate climate and seasonal variations that differed dramatically from tropical conditions. Taro cultivation proved impossible in most areas, while breadfruit and coconut could not survive the cold winters. Sweet potato cultivation succeeded in northern areas with suitable microclimates, but required careful attention to seasonal planting cycles and protection from frost damage. The adaptation to New Zealand's indigenous food resources required Maori populations to develop entirely new hunting, gathering and processing techniques. The large flightless birds known as moai provided unprecedented sources of protein, but required coordinated hunting strategies adapted to these massive creatures that could exceed 250 kilograms in weight. The development of specialised hunting techniques for moa and other indigenous fauna represented one of the most significant dietary adaptations in Polynesian history. Marine resources in New Zealand waters differ dramatically from those found in tropical Polynesia, requiring the development of new fishing techniques and equipment adapted to temperate species and conditions. The absence of tropical reef fish was compensated by abundant populations of temperate species, including snapper, kahawai, and various shellfish that required different harvesting strategies and processing methods. The construction of fortified settlements, known as PA, became a distinctive feature of Maori culture as populations adapted to the territorial competition that developed in New Zealand's resource-rich environment. These defensive complexes incorporated sophisticated earthwork fortifications that took advantage of New Zealand's varied topography to create nearly impregnable strongholds. The construction of PA required coordinated labour and engineering expertise that demonstrated the organisational capabilities of Maori communities. The completion of Polynesian expansion with the settlement of these remote frontiers established the largest culture area in human history, spanning over 20 million square kilometres of ocean and encompassing islands from tropical atolls barely above sea level to massive temperate land masses with snow-capped mountains. This vast triangle of human settlement, stretching from Hawaii in the north to New Zealand in the south and Easter Island in the east, represented an unprecedented achievement in human exploration and colonisation that demonstrated the remarkable capabilities of Polynesian maritime culture. The environmental diversity encompassed within this vast area required Polynesian populations to develop an extraordinary range of adaptive strategies while maintaining essential cultural connections across thousands of kilometres of ocean. From the volcanic peaks of Hawaii to the temperate forests of New Zealand, from the isolated grasslands of Easter Island to the countless coral atolls scattered throughout the central Pacific, Polynesian communities successfully established sustainable populations in virtually every type of island environment found in the Pacific Ocean. The successful colonisation of islands spanning from tropical atolls to temperate land masses created conditions for remarkable diversity in Polynesian political and social organisation. While maintaining fundamental cultural connections rooted in their shared ancestry, different island groups developed distinctive approaches to governance, social hierarchy, and community organisation that reflected their unique environmental circumstances, population densities, and resource availability. These variations range from highly stratified chiefdoms with elaborate court systems to relatively egalitarian communities where status differences remained minimal and decision-making processes emphasised consensus rather than hierarchical authority. The Hawaiian Islands developed perhaps the most complex and stratified political system in all of Polynesia, with chiefly hierarchies that achieved levels of centralised authority and social differentiation that approached those found in early state societies. The environmental abundance and large territorial scale of the Hawaiian archipelago enabled the support of elaborate chiefly courts with hundreds of specialised retainers, advisors, and ceremonial attendants. The paramount chiefs, known as Ali'i Nui, commanded territories encompassing entire islands or major portions of islands, controlling populations that numbered in the tens of thousands, and commanding tribute flows that supported magnificent displays of wealth and power. Hawaiian chiefly regalia reflected the sophisticated material culture that developed to support these elaborate political hierarchies. Feather cloaks and helmets, constructed from thousands of carefully selected feathers collected from specific bird species, required years of specialised labour to complete and represented investments of resources that could only be sustained by societies with substantial surplus production. The brilliant yellow feathers of the Hawaiian honeycreeper, supplemented by red feathers from other native species, created garments of extraordinary beauty that served as visible symbols of chiefly authority and divine connection. The construction of massive ceremonial complexes throughout the Hawaiian Islands provided physical settings appropriate for the elaborate ritual activities that legitimised chiefly authority and reinforced social hierarchies. These heiau complexes incorporated multiple structures including temples, residences for religious specialists, and gathering areas for community ceremonies. The largest heiau required coordinated labour from thousands of individuals over periods spanning multiple years, demonstrating the organisational capabilities of Hawaiian chiefly administrations and their ability to mobilise substantial resources for ceremonial purposes. Tahitian society developed political structures of comparable complexity, with paramount chiefs known as Ariai Rahi exercising authority over extensive territories that encompassed multiple islands within the Society Islands archipelago. The Tahitian political system incorporated sophisticated mechanisms for managing succession disputes and territorial boundaries, including elaborate genealogical recitations that could trace chiefly lineages back dozens of generations to divine ancestors. These genealogical traditions served not merely as historical records, but as legal documents that established territorial claims and succession rights with the precision of written constitutions. The Maori complexes that served as ceremonial centres throughout Tahitian society incorporated stone architecture of remarkable sophistication, with precisely fitted basalt blocks forming platforms and enclosures that could accommodate thousands of participants during major ceremonial gatherings. The construction techniques employed in these structures demonstrate advanced understanding of engineering principles, with foundations and drainage systems designed to withstand the tropical storms and seismic activity common throughout the Society Islands. The largest mare complexes included multiple courtyards, specialised structures for different types of ceremonies, and elaborate stone sculptures that depicted genealogical relationships and mythological narratives. Tongan political organisation developed along different lines, emphasising the integration of multiple, chiefly lineages, into a complex system of reciprocal obligations and shared authority rather than the more centralised hierarchies found in Hawaii and Tahiti. The Tusi Tonga, serving as a paramount chief with both political and religious authority, presided over a confederation of lesser chiefs who maintained substantial autonomy within their own territories while acknowledging overall Tongan supremacy. This system enabled Tonga to extend its influence across vast areas of the Central Pacific, while maintaining the flexibility necessary for managing diverse island environments and populations. The Tongan tribute system incorporated elaborate protocols for the collection and redistribution of goods that served both economic and ceremonial functions. Regular tribute presentations brought together representatives from throughout the Tongan sphere of influence, creating opportunities for political negotiation, marriage alliances, and cultural exchange that maintained social cohesion across widely scattered island communities. These gatherings featured competitive displays of wealth and generosity that reinforced social hierarchies, while providing mechanisms for redistributing resources between communities with different productive capabilities. Samoan society developed political institutions that balanced chiefly authority with strong traditions of community consultation and consensus decision-making. The Matai system, based on extended family groups known as aige, distributed political authority among numerous titled individuals who represented different kinship groups within village communities. These Matai titles carried specific rights and responsibilities that were carefully defined through oral traditions, creating a complex system of checks and balances that prevented the concentration of excessive power in individual hands while maintaining effective leadership structures. The Fono, or village council, served as the primary decision-making body in Samoan communities, bringing together Matai from different aiga to discuss matters affecting the entire village. These councils operated through extended discussion processes that emphasized achieving consensus rather than imposing decisions through hierarchical authority. The physical settings for Fono meetings, typically conducted in open-sided structures that allowed community observation, reinforced the participatory nature of Samoan political processes and ensured that decision-making remained transparent and accountable to community members. Markasan political organisation reflected the environmental constraints and cultural adaptations that developed in response to the challenging conditions of these remote volcanic islands. The steep topography and limited arable land of the Marquesas created conditions that favoured the development of competitive relationships between valley communities, leading to political systems that emphasised military leadership and defensive capabilities. Chiefs in Markasan society, known as Hakaiki, combined traditional Polynesian chiefly roles with specialised military functions that reflected the importance of warfare in inter-valley relationships. The construction of elaborate ceremonial platforms known as mei throughout the Marquesas provided focal points for community identity and religious activities that reinforced social hierarchies and territorial boundaries. These stone structures incorporated sophisticated architectural elements, including stepped platforms, stone sculptures, and specialised areas for different types of ceremonial activities. The investment of labour required for mei construction demonstrated community solidarity, while creating permanent markers of territorial control and cultural identity that persisted long after the communities that built them had disappeared. Easter Island developed perhaps the most distinctive political and social system in all of Polynesia, with institutions that reflected both the island's extreme isolation and its unique environmental challenges. The construction and transportation of the famous Moai statues required coordinated efforts from multiple family groups, creating political institutions that emphasised collective labour organisation and resource management. The Ahu platforms that supported these statues served as focal points for community ceremonies and ancestor veneration that reinforced social cohesion while marking territorial boundaries between different clan groups. The Tangata Manu, or Birdman cult that developed on Easter Island, represented a unique adaptation of Polynesian religious and political traditions to local conditions. Annual competitions to collect the first sooty tern egg from offshore islets determined political leadership for the following year, creating a system that combined elements of traditional chiefly succession with merit-based selection processes. These competitions required exceptional swimming and climbing abilities, ensuring that political leaders possessed the physical capabilities necessary for survival in Easter Island's challenging environment. The role of hereditary chiefs throughout Polynesian societies reflected fundamental beliefs about the divine nature of political authority and the connection between chiefly lineages and supernatural forces that controlled natural phenomena. Chiefs were understood to possess mena, a spiritual power that enabled them to influence weather patterns, ensure agricultural fertility, and provide protection from supernatural dangers. This divine authority was typically inherited through genealogical connections to founding ancestors who were believed to have descended from gods or to have achieved divine status through their exceptional accomplishments. The genealogical systems that legitimised chiefly authority throughout Polynesia represented sophisticated oral traditions that preserved historical information while serving essential political functions. These genealogies, often extending back 20 or 30 generations, provided legal frameworks for establishing territorial claims, succession rights, and social relationships between different chiefly lineages. The memorization and recitation of these genealogical traditions required specialized training and represented one of the most important intellectual achievements of Polynesian societies. Chiefly genealogies incorporated both historical information about actual ancestral figures and mythological narratives that connected human lineages to divine origins. The transition points between historical and mythological portions of these genealogies often marked significant cultural developments or migration episodes that shaped the development of particular island societies. The preservation of this information through oral tradition required remarkable memory skills and represented a form of historical documentation that rivals written records in its accuracy and detail. Social stratification in Polynesian societies typically included distinct classes of nobility, commoners, and in some societies, specialised groups of artisans and religious practitioners who occupied intermediate positions in the social hierarchy. The nobility, consisting of individuals with direct genealogical connections to chiefly lineages, enjoyed privileges including access to the finest foods, elaborate clothing and ornaments, and exemption from manual labour. These privileges were balanced by responsibilities for community leadership, ceremonial obligations, and the maintenance of cultural traditions that required extensive knowledge and specialised skills. Commoners in Polynesian societies, while lacking the hereditary privileges of nobility, typically enjoyed considerable personal freedom and economic security within their communities. Most commoners owned land, participated in community decision-making processes, and had access to the resources necessary for maintaining comfortable lifestyles. The obligations of commoners to their chiefs typically involved providing labour for community projects, contributing to ceremonial feasts, and participating in military activities when necessary. But these obligations were balanced by chiefly responsibilities to provide protection and ensure community welfare. Specialised artisan classes developed in many Polynesian societies, particularly those with sufficient population density and resource abundance to support economic specialisation. Master canoe builders, known by various terms including Tafanga Fauwaka in Tonga and Kahuna Kalaiwara in Hawaii, occupied positions of high status that reflected the crucial importance of their skills for community survival and prosperity. These specialists typically inherited their knowledge through family traditions and underwent extensive apprenticeships that could last many years before achieving recognition as master craftsmen. Religious specialists, including priests, healers, and ritual experts, formed another important category within Polynesian social hierarchies. These individuals, known by terms such as kahuna in Hawaii, tahunga in New Zealand, and tahua in Tahiti, possess specialized knowledge of religious traditions, healing practices, and ceremonial protocols that made them essential for community spiritual welfare. The training of religious specialists typically involved years of intensive study under established practitioners, with knowledge transmitted through carefully guarded oral traditions that maintained the exclusivity and authority of these specialized roles. Gender roles in Polynesian societies demonstrated considerable variation between different island groups, but generally provided women with significant opportunities for political participation and spiritual authority that exceeded those found in many other cultural traditions. Female chiefs, known by terms such as Alii Wahine in Hawaii and Arii Wahine in Tahiti, could inherit and exercise political authority equal to that of their male counterparts. These female leaders commanded the same respect and obedience as male chiefs, and participated fully in political decision-making, military leadership, and ceremonial activities. The institution of tapu, or sacred prohibitions, provided frameworks for regulating social behaviour and maintaining spiritual balance that affected both men and women, but often in different ways. Women's tapu frequently related to their reproductive capabilities and their roles in maintaining spiritual connections between the living and ancestral worlds. Menstrual restrictions and childbirth protocols reflected beliefs about women's spiritual power and their potential to influence supernatural forces, creating specialized roles and responsibilities that complemented rather than subordinated women's social positions. Female religious practitioners held positions of particular importance in many Polynesian societies, serving as priestesses, healers, and specialists in ceremonies related to fertility, childbirth, and ancestor veneration. These women possessed extensive knowledge of medicinal plants, ritual protocols, and spiritual traditions that made them essential for community welfare. The training of female religious specialists often involved different educational processes than those followed by men, with knowledge transmitted through female lineages and specialized initiation ceremonies that mark the transition to full practitioner status. Marriage patterns and kinship systems throughout Polynesian societies reflected the complex intersection of social hierarchy, political alliance, and economic cooperation that characterized these island communities. Chiefly marriages often served diplomatic functions, creating alliances between different territorial groups and establishing networks of mutual obligation that could extend across multiple islands. These political marriages required careful negotiation and elaborate ceremonial exchanges that demonstrated the wealth and status of the participating families while creating lasting bonds between their communities. The practice of polygamy among high-ranking chiefs reflected both their elevated social status and the political advantages of maintaining marriage connections with multiple powerful families. Chiefly households that included multiple wives from different lineages could draw upon diverse sources of support and influence, while creating offspring whose genealogical connections provided claims to multiple territories and titles. The management of these complex household arrangements required sophisticated social skills and demonstrated the organizational capabilities that justified chiefly authority. Adoption practices throughout Polynesian societies provided mechanisms for strengthening social bonds, managing population distribution, and ensuring the transmission of specialized knowledge between generations. Children were frequently raised by relatives other than their biological parents, creating networks of kinship obligations that extended throughout entire communities. These adoption arrangements often served strategic purposes, placing children in households where they could receive specialized training or creating bonds between families that might otherwise lack direct kinship connections. The intricate kinship networks and social hierarchies that characterize Polynesian societies were deeply intertwined with complex spiritual beliefs that governed virtually every aspect of daily life. These religious systems, while sharing fundamental concepts across the vast Pacific Triangle, developed distinctive regional variations that reflected local environmental conditions, historical experiences, and cultural innovations. At the heart of all Polynesian religious traditions lay the concept of mana, a spiritual force that permeated the universe and could be channeled, accumulated, and transmitted through proper ritual observance and genealogical connections. Mana represented far more than simple spiritual power. It constituted the fundamental energy that animated all existence, from the movement of celestial bodies to the growth of plants and the success of human endeavours. This force was understood to be concentrated in certain individuals, objects, and locations, with chiefs and religious specialists possessing particularly potent concentrations that enabled them to influence natural phenomena and communicate with supernatural beings. The accumulation of mana required careful attention to ritual protocols and behavioural restrictions, as improper conduct could cause this spiritual energy to dissipate or become corrupted, bringing misfortune upon entire communities. The manifestation of mana in chiefly lineages provided the spiritual foundation for political authority throughout Polynesian societies. Chiefs were believed to inherit concentrated mana from their divine ancestors, making their persons sacred and their commands spiritually binding upon their subjects. This inherited spiritual power was understood to be cumulative, with each generation potentially adding to the mana concentration of their lineage through proper conduct and ritual observance. The most powerful chiefs possessed mana so intense that their mere presence could affect the fertility of crops, the abundance of fish, and the success of voyaging expeditions. Complementing the concept of mana was the equally fundamental principle of tapu, a system of sacred restrictions that regulated human behaviour and maintained spiritual balance within communities. Tapu prohibitions governed interactions between individuals of different social ranks, prescribed proper conduct in sacred spaces, and established behavioural codes that prevented the contamination or dissipation of spiritual power. These restrictions were not arbitrary rules, but represented essential spiritual technologies that enabled Polynesian communities to harness and direct supernatural forces for their benefit. The complexity of tapu systems varied considerably between different island groups, with some societies developing elaborate codes that governed virtually every aspect of daily life, while others maintained more flexible approaches that emphasized general principles rather than specific prohibitions. In Hawaii, the kapu system reached extraordinary levels of detail, with restrictions governing everything from the foods that different social classes could consume to the postures that commoners must adopt when in the presence of high-ranking chiefs. Violations of these sacred prohibitions were believed to bring supernatural punishment that could affect entire communities, making strict observance essential for collective welfare. Tapu restrictions frequently centered around activities and locations associated with the gods and ancestral spirits, creating sacred spaces where normal social rules were suspended and supernatural forces could be safely contacted and propitiated. Temples and ceremonial grounds throughout Polynesia were surrounded by elaborate tapu protocols that governed who could enter these spaces, what activities could be performed within them, and what ritual preparations were necessary before approaching the gods. These restrictions served both practical and spiritual purposes, maintaining the sanctity of religious sites while ensuring that only properly prepared individuals could participate in dangerous supernatural communications. The worship of ancestral spirits formed another crucial component of Polynesian religious systems, with deceased family members and legendary figures continuing to play active roles in the lives of their descendants. These ancestral spirits, known by various terms including Akua Aumakua in Hawaii and Atua Tupuna in other Polynesian languages, served as intermediaries between the living and the divine realm, providing guidance, protection and assistance to their descendants in exchange for proper ritual attention and offerings. The maintenance of ancestral shrines and the performance of regular ceremonies honouring deceased relatives represented essential religious obligations that bound families together across generations. Ancestral veneration practices incorporated sophisticated understanding of genealogical relationships and their spiritual significance. with different ancestors providing different types of assistance based on their achievements during life and their position within family lineages. Ancestors who had been skilled navigators continued to provide guidance for voyaging expeditions, while those known for their agricultural expertise could ensure crop fertility and protection from natural disasters. The most powerful ancestral spirits were those of founding chiefs and culture heroes whose manner had been so great during life that their spiritual influence continued to shape the destiny of entire communities. The physical manifestations of ancestral presence took various forms throughout Polynesian societies, including carved images, sacred stones, and natural features such as unusual trees or rock formations that were believed to house particular spirits. These ancestral shrines required regular maintenance and offerings, with family groups taking turns providing food, flowers, and other gifts that demonstrated continuing respect and ensured ongoing spiritual protection. The neglect of ancestral obligations was believed to result in withdrawal of spiritual support and potential punishment through illness, accident, or failure in important endeavours. Natural forces throughout the Pacific received recognition as manifestations of divine power that required careful propitiation and respectful interaction. Volcanic activity, particularly prominent in the Hawaiian Islands, was understood as the direct action of fire deities whose moods and intentions could be influenced through proper ceremonial observance. Pele, the Hawaiian volcano goddess, commanded elaborate ritual cycles that accompanied volcanic eruptions and the creation of new land through lava flows. Her priests monitored volcanic activity and performed ceremonies designed to direct lava flows away from populated areas, while ensuring that the goddess received appropriate recognition for her creative powers. Ocean deities received particular attention throughout Polynesian religious systems, reflecting the fundamental importance of maritime activities in island societies. Tangaroa, known by various names throughout different island groups, served as the primary ocean deity whose favour was essential for successful fishing, voyaging, and all other marine activities. Elaborate ceremonies preceded major voyaging expeditions, with offerings and prayers designed to ensure favourable winds, calm seas, and protection from the supernatural dangers that lurked in the vast Pacific waters. Weather deities controlled the wind and rain patterns that determined agricultural success and voyaging conditions throughout the Pacific. These supernatural beings required regular propitiation through ceremonies timed to coincide with seasonal changes and critical agricultural periods. The priests responsible for weather magic possessed detailed knowledge of meteorological patterns and seasonal variations that enabled them to predict and potentially influence climatic conditions through proper ritual procedures. Their ceremonies often incorporated elaborate dances and chants that mimicked natural phenomena while appealing to the deities for favourable conditions. Agricultural deities received extensive ritual attention throughout Polynesian societies, with elaborate ceremonies marking planting seasons, harvest periods, and other crucial agricultural activities. Lono, the Hawaiian deity associated with fertility and peaceful pursuits, commanded major ceremonial cycles that coincided with the rainy season when agricultural activities intensified. These ceremonies incorporated competitive games, feasting, and tribute presentations that celebrated agricultural abundance while ensuring continued divine favour for future growing seasons. The mythological traditions that preserved and transmitted Polynesian religious knowledge incorporated sophisticated narratives that served multiple functions as entertainment, historical record, and spiritual instruction. These stories, passed down through generations of skilled storytellers, contain detailed information about the origins of the universe, the genealogies of gods and heroes, and the proper relationships between humans and supernatural forces. The complexity and internal consistency of these mythological systems demonstrate remarkable intellectual achievements that rival any written religious literature in their sophistication and depth. Creation stories throughout Polynesia shared fundamental themes while incorporating regional variations that reflected local environmental conditions and cultural experiences. Most Polynesian creation myths began with primordial darkness or void from which divine beings emerged through processes of separation generation, or spontaneous manifestation. The creation of land, sea, and sky typically involved conflicts or collaborations between these primordial deities, with different versions emphasizing different aspects of cosmic organization and divine relationships. The emergence of humans within these creation narratives usually occurred through divine intervention or the transformation of existing materials through supernatural power. Some traditions describe the creation of the first humans from clay, sand, or other earth materials, while others portrayed human origins as resulting from unions between gods and earlier created beings. These origin stories provided not only explanations for human existence, but also genealogical frameworks that connected contemporary populations to divine ancestors and justified social hierarchies based on proximity to original divine sources. The exploits of culture heroes, particularly the widespread Maui cycle, provided mythological explanations for natural phenomena while celebrating human ingenuity and courage in confronting supernatural challenges. Maui, known throughout Polynesia by various names and attributed with different specific achievements, represented the archetypal trickster hero whose cleverness and determination enabled him to obtain benefits for humanity through outwitting gods and supernatural beings. His legendary accomplishments included fishing up islands from the ocean floor, slowing the sun's passage across the sky to provide more daylight for human activities, and obtaining fire for human use from the underworld. The Maui legends incorporated sophisticated understanding of natural phenomena while providing entertaining narratives that could be adapted to different local conditions and cultural needs. The story of Maui fishing up islands provided mythological explanations for the geological origins of different archipelagos while celebrating the importance of fishing and voyaging skills in Polynesian society. Different island groups developed their own versions of these stories, with local variations that incorporated specific geographical features and cultural details that made the narratives relevant to particular communities. Migration narratives formed another crucial category of Polynesian mythology, preserving historical information about voyaging expeditions and island colonization within supernatural frameworks that emphasize divine guidance and heroic achievement. These stories typically describe the adventures of legendary navigators who discovered new islands through following divine signs, supernatural guidance, or prophetic dreams. The incorporation of accurate geographical and navigational information within these mythological narratives suggests that they preserve genuine historical memories of actual voyaging expeditions, while embedding this information within spiritual frameworks that emphasize the sacred nature of Pacific exploration. The genealogical connections between mythological figures and historical chiefs provided frameworks for understanding political authority and social hierarchy that extended back to divine origins. These genealogical traditions, often extending through dozens of generations, connected contemporary rulers to legendary heroes and ultimately to the gods themselves. The memorization and recitation of these genealogies required specialized training and represented one of the most sophisticated intellectual achievements of Polynesian oral traditions. Religious practices throughout Polynesia incorporated elaborate ceremonial complexes that served as focal points for community spiritual activities and demonstrations of collective devotion to the gods. These marae, heiau, me'ai, and other ceremonial structures represented massive investments of community labour and resources that created permanent sacred spaces where humans could safely interact with supernatural forces. The construction of these complexes required sophisticated understanding of engineering principles, astronomical alignments, and ritual requirements that demonstrated the advanced technical capabilities of Polynesian societies. The architectural features of Polynesian ceremonial complexes varied considerably between different island groups, while sharing fundamental design principles that reflected common religious concepts and ritual needs. Stone platforms provided elevated spaces where offerings could be presented and ceremonies performed, while enclosing walls created sacred boundaries that separated ritual activities from ordinary daily life. Specialized structures within these complexes included altars for different types of offerings, houses for religious specialists, and gathering areas where community members could observe and participate in ceremonial activities. Human sacrifice, practiced in some Polynesian societies during certain types of ceremonies, represented the ultimate offering that could be presented to the gods during critical situations requiring maximum supernatural intervention. These practices, most extensively documented in Hawaii and Tahiti, typically occurred during major political or religious crises when communities faced threats that required extraordinary divine assistance. The selection of sacrificial victims followed specific protocols that emphasized the spiritual value of the offering, with high-status individuals sometimes being chosen because their accumulated mana made them particularly valuable gifts to the gods. The ceremonial protocols surrounding human sacrifice incorporated elaborate rituals designed to ensure that these offerings achieved their intended spiritual effects while protecting the community from supernatural dangers associated with taking human life. Priests responsible for conducting these ceremonies possessed specialized knowledge of the ritual procedures necessary for properly presenting human offerings while maintaining their own spiritual safety and that of their communities. The locations where these sacrifices occurred became permanently sacred spaces that required ongoing ritual attention and careful management to prevent spiritual contamination. Funeral practices throughout Polynesian societies reflected complex beliefs about the nature of death and the continuing existence of spirits after physical death. These rituals served multiple purposes, including ensuring the safe passage of deceased individuals to the ancestral realm, preventing spiritual harm to surviving family members, and establishing the ongoing relationships between the living and the dead that would characterize ancestral veneration practices. The elaborate nature of many Polynesian funeral ceremonies demonstrated the importance placed on proper death rituals and their role in maintaining spiritual balance within communities. The treatment of chiefly remains often involved mummification or other preservation techniques that maintained physical connections to powerful ancestral spirits, while creating sacred objects that could serve as focal points for ongoing ritual attention. In Hawaii, the bones of high-ranking chiefs were carefully cleaned and preserved in special bundles that were hidden in secret caves or other protected locations. These skeletal remains retained the manner of their original owners and could provide spiritual assistance to their descendants when properly approached through appropriate ritual procedures. The role of religious specialists in maintaining and transmitting spiritual knowledge represented one of the most crucial functions in Polynesian societies, as these individuals served as intermediaries between human communities and the supernatural forces that governed their welfare. These Tahunga, Kahuna, Tahua, and other ritual experts underwent extensive training that could span decades and involved mastering complex bodies of knowledge including genealogies, ritual procedures, astronomical observations, and healing practices. Their expertise was essential for conducting the elaborate ceremonies that maintained proper relationships with gods and ancestors, while ensuring community spiritual welfare. The training of religious specialists typically began in childhood, with the identification of individuals who showed particular aptitude for spiritual matters, or who belonged to families with hereditary obligations to provide ritual services. These candidates underwent rigorous educational programs that involved memorizing vast amounts of oral tradition, learning complex ritual procedures, and developing the spiritual sensitivity necessary for communicating with supernatural beings. The completion of this training was marked by initiation ceremonies that formally recognized the new practitioner's authority and established their position within the community's spiritual hierarchy. The sophisticated religious and ceremonial systems that governed Polynesian spiritual life found their most tangible expression through an extraordinary flowering of artistic traditions that transformed everyday objects into vessels of cultural meaning and aesthetic achievement. These artistic expressions, ranging from monumental stone sculptures to intricate personal ornaments, represented far more than decorative embellishment. They served as repositories of cultural knowledge, markers of social identity, and conduits for spiritual power that connected human communities with their ancestral heritage and divine origins. Woodcarving traditions throughout Polynesia, achieved levels of technical sophistication and artistic refinement that rank among humanity's greatest achievements in sculptural art. The master carvers who created these works, known by various terms including Tufangata in Tonga and Tahua Tairi in Tahiti, underwent decades of intensive training that combined technical skill development with deep immersion in cultural traditions and spiritual practices. These artisans possessed intimate knowledge of wood properties, tool techniques, and design principles that enabled them to transform raw timber into objects of extraordinary beauty and cultural significance. The selection of appropriate wood species for different types of carving projects required extensive botanical knowledge and understanding of how different timber characteristics affected both the carving process and the final product's durability and appearance. Hawaiian artisans prized koa wood for its rich golden colour and fine grain structure that allowed for intricate detail work, while its resistance to insect damage and weathering made it ideal for objects intended for long-term use. Sandalwood, valued throughout Polynesia for its aromatic properties and spiritual associations, was reserved for the most sacred objects and ceremonial items that required special spiritual protection. Maori carvers in New Zealand developed distinctive techniques for working with the native woods available in temperate forests, particularly Totara and Kauri species, that differed significantly from tropical timbers used elsewhere in Polynesia. The adaptation of traditional carving techniques to these new materials required innovative approaches to tool design and cutting methods, while maintaining the essential aesthetic principles that connected Maori artistic traditions to their Polynesian heritage. The development of specialised adzes and chisels suited to New Zealand woods demonstrated the remarkable adaptability of Polynesian craftsmanship traditions. The iconographic programs that governed Polynesian wood carving incorporated complex symbolic systems that conveyed information about genealogical relationships, spiritual beliefs, and cultural values through carefully orchestrated combinations of human figures, geometric patterns, and stylized representations of natural phenomena. These symbolic vocabularies varied between different island groups, while sharing fundamental design principles that reflected common Polynesian cultural foundations. The ability to read and interpret these symbolic systems required extensive cultural knowledge that was transmitted through specialized training programs alongside the technical skills of carving. Human figures in Polynesian carving traditions served multiple representational functions, depicting ancestral spirits, legendary heroes, and divine beings whose presence provided spiritual protection and cultural continuity for their descendants. These anthropomorphic sculptures typically emphasized specific anatomical features that conveyed information about the subject's identity, status, and spiritual significance. Enlarged heads often indicated the concentration of mana and intellectual power, while exaggerated sexual characteristics celebrated fertility and reproductive capacity that ensured community survival and prosperity. The famous Moai sculptures of Easter Island represented the most monumental expression of Polynesian anthropomorphic carving traditions, with these massive stone figures incorporating design elements that connected them to wood carving traditions found throughout the Pacific. The distinctive facial features of the Moai, including their prominent noses, deep-set eyes, and elongated ears, reflected aesthetic preferences that appeared in various forms across Polynesian artistic traditions. The scale and permanence of these stone sculptures created lasting monuments to ancestral presence that continue to influence island spiritual life long after the communities that created them had disappeared. Geometric patterns in Polynesian carving serve both decorative and symbolic functions, with specific motif combinations conveying information about tribal affiliations, genealogical connections, and spiritual relationships that were essential for maintaining social organisation and cultural identity. These patterns often incorporated mathematical principles based on systematic repetition, symmetrical arrangements, and proportional relationships that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of design theory and aesthetic principles. The precision required for executing these complex geometric programs demanded exceptional technical skill and careful planning that reflected the high status accorded to master carvers. Maori carving traditions developed perhaps the most complex geometric vocabulary in all of Polynesia, with intricate spiral patterns known as koru that represented natural growth processes and spiritual energy flows. These spiraling motifs could be combined in elaborate compositions that covered entire surfaces with interconnected patterns that seemed to pulse with organic vitality. The execution of these designs required not only technical precision, but also deep understanding of their cultural significance and proper ritual protocols for their creation and use. The integration of carving traditions with architectural elements created some of the most impressive artistic achievements in Polynesian culture, with elaborately decorated buildings that served as focal points for community identity and ceremonial activities. Hawaiian heialali'i, or chiefly residences, incorporated carved posts, beams and panels that transformed these structures into three-dimensional galleries displaying the finest examples of artistic craftsmanship. The coordination required between architects, carvers and other specialists demonstrated the sophisticated project management capabilities that characterised major Polynesian construction undertakings. Maori meeting houses, known as Wairawakairo, represented the culmination of Polynesian architectural carving traditions, with every surface covered in intricate designs that told the genealogical and mythological history of the community. These structures were conceived as representations of ancestral bodies, with the ridgepole representing the spine, the rafters serving as ribs, and the carved panels depicting various ancestors and legendary figures. The construction of a new meeting house required years of coordinated effort from multiple carving specialists and represented one of the most significant cultural undertakings that a Maori community could accomplish. The production of bark cloth, known throughout Polynesia by variations of the term tapa, represented another major artistic tradition that combined technical expertise with aesthetic sophistication to create textiles of extraordinary beauty and cultural significance. The manufacture of tapa required detailed knowledge of plant species, processing techniques, and decorative methods that were typically transmitted through female lineages and specialised training programs. The finest tapa production demanded years of experience and represented one of the most prestigious accomplishments available to women in many Polynesian societies. The selection and preparation of raw materials for tapa production required extensive botanical knowledge and understanding of how different plant species responded to various processing techniques. Paper mulberry, introduced throughout Polynesia during the initial colonisation period, became the preferred material for finest quality tapa due to its long fibres and ability to produce smooth, even surfaces suitable for intricate decoration. The cultivation of paper mulberry groves required careful attention to soil conditions, pruning techniques, and harvesting schedules that maximised both fibre quality and sustainable production. The beating process that transformed strips of inner bark into flexible textile sheets required specialised tools and techniques that varied between different island groups, while sharing fundamental principles based on systematic fibre expansion and consolidation. Wooden beaters, carved with distinctive groove patterns that created characteristic textures in the finished cloth, represented sophisticated tools that combined functional efficiency with aesthetic considerations. The rhythm and technique of the beating process required years of practice to master and often incorporated musical elements that made the work more enjoyable while ensuring consistent results. Hawaiian kapa production achieved extraordinary levels of refinement, with the finest examples featuring paper-thin sheets that rivaled silk in their delicacy and smoothness. The creation of these premium textiles required exceptional skill in controlling the beating process to achieve uniform thickness, while avoiding tears or weak spots that would compromise the fabric's integrity. The waterproofing treatments applied to finished kapa involved complex preparations using plant dyes and natural resins that provided protection from moisture, while maintaining the textile's flexibility and appearance. The decorative techniques applied to finished tapa incorporated sophisticated design systems that combined geometric patterns with naturalistic motifs to create textiles of extraordinary visual impact. Stamping techniques using carved wooden blocks or bamboo implements allowed for the rapid application of repeated patterns across large textile surfaces, while hand-painting methods enabled the creation of unique designs that reflected individual artistic vision and cultural themes. The coordination of these different decorative approaches required careful planning and exceptional technical skill to achieve harmonious overall compositions. Fijian masi production developed distinctive characteristics that reflected the unique cultural synthesis that occurred in these islands at the western edge of Polynesian expansion. The incorporation of design elements that showed both Polynesian and Melanesian influences created artistic traditions that bridged different cultural spheres while maintaining their own distinctive identity. The ceremonial uses of masi in Fijian society, particularly for chiefly installations and marriage ceremonies, required the production of enormous pieces that could cover entire buildings or serve as backdrops for major community gatherings. Tongan Ngatu traditions emphasise the communal aspects of tapa production, with groups of women working together in organised production sessions that combined practical textile manufacture with social interaction and cultural education. These collaborative work sessions, known as kautaha, provided opportunities for the transmission of technical knowledge while reinforcing social bonds and community solidarity. The finished Ngatu products were often presented as gifts during important ceremonies, creating networks of reciprocal obligation that extended throughout Tongan society and beyond to other island groups. Tattooing traditions throughout Polynesia represented perhaps the most intimate form of artistic expression, transforming the human body into a canvas for displaying cultural identity, social status, and spiritual beliefs through permanent decorative modifications that accompanied individuals throughout their lives. The practice of tattooing, known by variations of the Polynesian term tatau, required specialised knowledge of design systems, technical procedures, and cultural protocols that made tattoo artists among the most respected specialists in their communities. The tools and techniques used for Polynesian tattooing demonstrated remarkable sophistication and regional variation, while sharing fundamental principles based on puncturing the skin with sharp implements dipped in pigment. Traditional tattooing implements, constructed from materials including bone, shell, and metal when available, were carefully designed to create specific line qualities and shading effects that contributed to the overall aesthetic impact of the finished designs. The preparation and maintenance of these tools required specialised knowledge and represented a significant investment in professional equipment. Marquesan tattooing traditions achieved extraordinary levels of complexity and coverage, with some individuals receiving full-body tattoos that incorporated thousands of individual design elements into unified compositions that told their personal and genealogical history. The execution of these extensive tattoo programs required multiple sessions spanning months or years, during which the recipient demonstrated their courage and commitment to cultural traditions, while the artist displayed their mastery of technical skills and design principles. The pain endured during these lengthy procedures was understood as a form of spiritual purification that enhanced the tattoo's protective and empowering qualities. The pigments used in Polynesian tattooing were typically derived from natural sources including charcoal, plant materials, and mineral deposits that were carefully processed to achieve the desired colour qualities and permanence. The preparation of tattoo pigments required detailed knowledge of material properties and chemical processes that ensured the colours would remain vibrant and stable over time. The spiritual significance attributed to these pigments often required special collection and preparation rituals that enhanced their effectiveness as vehicles for conveying mana and spiritual protection. The design systems that governed Polynesian tattooing incorporated complex symbolic vocabularies that conveyed information about the wearer's identity, achievements, and spiritual relationships through carefully orchestrated combinations of geometric patterns, naturalistic motifs, and abstract symbols. These design languages varied between different island groups while sharing fundamental principles that reflected common cultural foundations and aesthetic preferences. The ability to create and interpret these symbolic systems required extensive cultural knowledge that was transmitted through specialised apprenticeship programs. Samoan Tatau traditions developed distinctive characteristics that emphasised the integration of individual design elements into unified compositions that covered large areas of the body with flowing, interconnected patterns. The peae, or traditional male tattoo, extended from the waist to the knees and incorporated hundreds of individual motifs that were combined according to established principles, while allowing for personal variation and artistic interpretation. The completion of a peae represented a major life achievement that marked the transition to full adult status, and demonstrated the recipient's commitment to Samoan cultural values. The social and ceremonial contexts surrounding tattooing practices throughout Polynesia reflected the profound cultural significance of these permanent body modifications and their role in marking important life transitions and social relationships. Tattooing ceremonies often involved elaborate rituals that emphasized the spiritual dimensions of the process, while providing opportunities for community celebration and cultural education. The pain endured during tattooing was understood as a form of spiritual testing that demonstrated the recipient's worthiness to bear these powerful cultural symbols. The oral literature traditions that preserved and transmitted Polynesian cultural knowledge represented sophisticated intellectual achievements that rivaled any written literature in their complexity, artistic merit, and cultural significance. These oral traditions encompassed multiple genres including genealogical chants, epic narratives, ceremonial songs, and instructional recitations that served various functions within Polynesian societies while maintaining the cultural knowledge necessary for community survival and prosperity. Genealogical chants formed the foundation of Polynesian oral literature, preserving detailed information about family relationships, territorial claims, and historical events within poetic structures that aided memorization and transmission across generations. These chants, known by various terms including Mele Koihonua in Hawaii and Pehetaumu in Tahiti, could extend for hours and contained precise information about hundreds of individuals and their relationships to contemporary community members. The accuracy of these genealogical traditions was essential for maintaining social organisation and political legitimacy within Polynesian societies. Epic narratives celebrating the exploits of legendary heroes and culture figures provided entertainment while transmitting cultural values and historical information through engaging storylines that captured audience attention and imagination. The Maui cycle, found throughout Polynesia with regional variations, represented one of the most widespread and enduring of these epic traditions, with stories that explained natural phenomena while celebrating human ingenuity and determination. The performance of these narratives required exceptional memory skills and dramatic ability that made accomplished storytellers among the most valued cultural specialists in their communities. Ceremonial songs that accompanied religious rituals and community celebrations incorporated sophisticated musical structures with complex rhythmic patterns and melodic lines that enhanced the spiritual effectiveness of ritual activities while providing aesthetic pleasure for participants and observers. These songs often included esoteric language and symbolic references that required specialized knowledge to fully understand, making them vehicles for transmitting religious and cultural information to initiated community members while maintaining their mystery and power. The architectural traditions that developed throughout Polynesian societies demonstrated remarkable adaptation to diverse environmental conditions, while maintaining essential design principles that reflected common cultural values and practical requirements. These building traditions encompass structures ranging from simple family dwellings to elaborate ceremonial complexes that required coordinated efforts from multiple specialists and represented major community investments in permanent cultural infrastructure. Samoan fail construction represented one of the most distinctive architectural traditions in Polynesia, with open-sided structures that provided excellent ventilation and flexibility for different uses while incorporating sophisticated engineering principles that enabled these buildings to withstand tropical storms and other environmental challenges. The curved roof profiles of traditional fail required expert knowledge of structural mechanics and material science that enabled builders to create stable, durable structures using only organic materials and traditional joining techniques. Hawaiian heiau architecture incorporated massive stone construction that created permanent ceremonial spaces capable of accommodating large community gatherings, while providing appropriate settings for elaborate religious rituals. The precision of stone fitting in the largest heiau demonstrated advanced understanding of engineering principles and construction techniques that enabled these structures to survive centuries of weathering and seismic activity. The astronomical alignments incorporated into many heiau designs reflected sophisticated knowledge of celestial phenomena and their cultural significance. Maori architectural traditions adapted traditional Polynesian building principles to the temperate conditions and different materials available in New Zealand, creating distinctive structures that maintained cultural continuity while responding to new environmental challenges. The development of specialised techniques for working with New Zealand timbers and the incorporation of elaborate carving programs into architectural elements demonstrated the remarkable adaptability of Polynesian cultural traditions and their capacity for innovation within established frameworks. The artistic achievements and sophisticated cultural systems that had flourished across Polynesian societies for over a millennium would face their greatest challenge with the arrival of European explorers beginning in the 16th century. These initial contacts, starting with Spanish expeditions searching for new trade routes and territorial claims, marked the beginning of a catastrophic period that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of Polynesian civilization and leave lasting scars that persist to this day. The first documented European encounter with Polynesian populations occurred in 1521 when Ferdinand Magellan's expedition reached Guam in the Mariana Islands, though these islands lay at the western periphery of the Polynesian cultural sphere. The Spanish crew's initial interactions with the Chamorro people established patterns of misunderstanding, conflict, and cultural arrogance that would characterize European-Polynesian relations for centuries. Magellan's men, exhausted from months at sea and desperately short of provisions, interpreted Chamorro curiosity about European goods as theft, leading to violent confrontations that resulted in numerous indigenous deaths and the burning of several villages. Spanish exploration continued sporadically throughout the 16th and early 17th centuries, with expeditions led by Alvaro de Mendana encountering the Marquesas Islands in 1595 and the Santa Cruz Islands in 1606. These voyages, motivated primarily by Spanish desires to establish Pacific trade routes and locate the mythical southern continent, brought devastating consequences for the Polynesian populations they encountered. Mendana's crew, suffering from scurvy and other diseases, carried pathogens to which Polynesian populations had no immunity, initiating epidemic cycles that would decimate island communities long after the Spanish ships had departed. The Spanish encounters with Marquesan populations demonstrated the profound cultural misunderstandings that characterized early European Polynesian contact. Spanish explorers, operating within European frameworks of territorial possession and resource extraction, failed to comprehend the complex social protocols and spiritual beliefs that governed Polynesian interactions with strangers. Their attempts to claim islands for the Spanish crown through formal ceremonies conducted in Latin held no meaning for Polynesian observers, while their demands for provisions and water violated traditional protocols for guest-host relationships that had regulated inter-island contact for centuries. Dutch exploration under Abel Tasman in 1642 to 1643 brought European contact to New Zealand and Tonga, introducing new patterns of interaction that combined commercial interests with scientific curiosity. Tasman's encounters with Maori populations in New Zealand's South Island resulted in violent clashes that left several Dutch sailors dead and convinced European authorities that Pacific Islanders were inherently hostile and dangerous. These initial impressions, recorded in official Dutch reports and widely circulated throughout European maritime circles, established negative stereotypes about Polynesian peoples that influenced subsequent European policies and attitudes. The Dutch approach to Pacific exploration emphasized commercial opportunities and strategic positioning rather than territorial conquest, but their interactions with Polynesian populations proved equally destructive. Dutch trading practices, based on European concepts of individual ownership and market exchange, conflicted fundamentally with Polynesian gift-giving traditions and collective resource management systems. These economic misunderstandings led to conflicts that often escalated into violence, as European demands for exclusive trading rights violated traditional Polynesian principles of reciprocal exchange and community solidarity. British exploration under Captain James Cook between 1768 and 1779 marked a new phase of European Polynesian contact that combined scientific objectives with imperial ambitions. Cook's 3 Pacific voyages brought sustained European presence to major Polynesian archipelagos, including Tahiti, Hawaii, New Zealand, and Tonga, establishing patterns of interaction that would profoundly influence subsequent colonial relationships. The detailed ethnographic observations recorded by Cook and his crew provided Europeans with their first systematic knowledge of Polynesian societies, but these accounts were filtered through European cultural assumptions that often misrepresented or oversimplified complex indigenous institutions. Cook's initial reception in many Polynesian societies reflected traditional protocols for welcoming distinguished visitors, with elaborate ceremonies and generous hospitality that Europeans interpreted as evidence of their technological and cultural superiority. The coincidence of Cook's arrival in Hawaii during the Makahiki season, when the god Lono was traditionally honoured, led to his identification with this deity and reception as a divine figure. This misunderstanding, based on European inability to comprehend Polynesian religious concepts and seasonal ceremonial cycles, created expectations that ultimately contributed to Cook's death during his return to Hawaii in 1779. French exploration under Louis Antoine de Bougainville and later expeditions brought additional European presence to Polynesian waters, introducing competing imperial claims and cultural influences that further complicated indigenous responses to foreign contact. French explorers, influenced by Enlightenment ideals about noble savages and natural society, often romanticized Polynesian cultures while simultaneously seeking to exploit their resources and strategic locations. These contradictory attitudes, combining admiration with exploitation, characterized much of subsequent European-Polynesian interaction and reflected fundamental European inability to understand indigenous societies on their own terms. The introduction of European diseases represented the most devastating consequence of early contact, with epidemic cycles that reduced Polynesian populations by an estimated 80 to 90% in many areas within the first century of sustained European presence. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhoid, and other infectious diseases spread rapidly through Polynesian communities that lacked immunity to Old World pathogens. The demographic catastrophe that resulted from these epidemics destroyed the population base necessary for maintaining traditional cultural institutions and left surviving communities vulnerable to further European exploitation and control. The impact of epidemic diseases varied between different island groups depending on the timing and intensity of European contact, but nowhere escaped the devastating consequences of pathogen introduction. In Hawaii, population estimates suggest a decline from approximately 400,000 people at the time of first European contact to fewer than 40,000 by the 1890s. Similar demographic collapses occurred throughout Polynesia, with some smaller islands losing their entire populations to disease and others experiencing such severe depopulation that traditional social organisation became impossible to maintain. The psychological and cultural trauma associated with these population losses compounded the physical devastation of epidemic diseases. Traditional healing practices, based on herbal remedies and spiritual interventions, proved ineffective against European diseases, undermining confidence in indigenous medical knowledge and religious systems. the death of large numbers of elders and ritual specialists during epidemic outbreaks resulted in irreversible losses of cultural knowledge, as oral traditions that had been transmitted across generations for centuries disappeared with their carriers. Missionary activities, beginning in earnest during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, introduced systematic campaigns to suppress traditional Polynesian religious practices and replace them with Christian beliefs and institutions. Protestant missionaries from the London Missionary Society established themselves in Tahiti in 1797, followed by American Protestant missions in Hawaii beginning in 1820 and various Catholic missions throughout the Pacific during the mid-19th century. These missionary efforts, while often motivated by genuine religious conviction and humanitarian concerns, resulted in deliberate destruction of indigenous spiritual traditions and cultural practices. The missionary assault on traditional Polynesian religion involved systematic destruction of temples, sacred objects, and ceremonial sites that had served as focal points for community spiritual life for over a millennium. In Hawaii, the arrival of American missionaries coincided with the indigenous abolition of the kapu system in 1819, creating a spiritual vacuum that missionaries rushed to fill with Christian doctrine. The burning of carved images, dismantling of heiau complexes, and prohibition of traditional ceremonies eliminated the physical infrastructure that had supported Polynesian religious practices while criminalizing the spiritual beliefs that had provided meaning and structure to indigenous life. The suppression of traditional cultural practices extended beyond religious activities to encompass virtually every aspect of Polynesian social organization and artistic expression. Missionaries condemned traditional dances as immoral, prohibited the wearing of traditional clothing as indecent, and banned the practice of tattooing as barbaric. These cultural prohibitions, enforced through legal codes imposed by newly converted indigenous rulers, severed connections between contemporary Polynesian populations and their ancestral traditions, while creating shame and confusion about indigenous identity and heritage. The introduction of written languages through missionary translation projects, while preserving some aspects of Polynesian oral traditions, fundamentally altered the nature of cultural transmission and knowledge preservation. The reduction of complex oral literatures to written texts eliminated the performative dimensions of traditional storytelling, while imposing European linguistic categories and religious interpretations on indigenous narratives. Missionary translations of the Bible into Polynesian languages introduced foreign concepts and theological frameworks that gradually displaced indigenous spiritual vocabularies and worldviews. Educational systems established by missionaries emphasized European cultural values and practical skills, while systematically devaluing indigenous knowledge and learning traditions. Mission schools taught literacy in European languages, European history and geography, and Christian theology while prohibiting the use of indigenous languages and the transmission of traditional knowledge. These educational policies created generations of Polynesian children who were alienated from their ancestral cultures while being inadequately prepared for successful integration into European-dominated societies. Colonial exploitation of Polynesian resources and labour intensified throughout the 19th century, as European and American commercial interests established permanent operations throughout the Pacific. The sandalwood trade in Hawaii during the early 1800s depleted these valuable forests while creating debt relationships that bound Hawaiian chiefs to American merchants and undermined traditional resource management systems. Similar patterns of resource extraction occurred throughout Polynesia, with European traders exploiting everything from pearl shell to coconut oil, while offering manufactured goods that created dependency relationships and disrupted traditional economic systems. The whaling industry brought thousands of European and American sailors to Polynesian ports during the mid-19th century, creating demand for provisions, repairs, and entertainment that fundamentally altered island economies and social relationships. Whaling ships required fresh food, water, and supplies that Polynesian communities provided in exchange for metal tools, firearms, and other manufactured goods. These commercial relationships introduced market economics based on individual profit rather than collective welfare, undermining traditional systems of reciprocal exchange and community resource sharing. Labour recruitment for overseas plantations, particularly in Peru and Australia, removed substantial numbers of young Polynesian men from their home communities during the mid-19th century. These recruiting operations, often conducted through deception or coercion, transported Polynesian workers to foreign plantations, where they faced harsh working conditions, cultural isolation, and limited opportunities for return. The demographic impact of this labour recruitment compounded the population losses from epidemic diseases, while removing productive individuals essential for maintaining traditional economic and social systems. Land appropriation by European settlers and commercial enterprises eliminated the territorial base necessary for traditional Polynesian subsistence and social organisation. Colonial governments, established through treaties that Polynesian leaders often signed, without understanding their implications, imposed European concepts of individual land ownership that conflicted fundamentally with traditional systems of collective resource management. The privatisation of land that had been managed communally for centuries created opportunities for European acquisition, while leaving indigenous populations without access to the resources necessary for maintaining their traditional lifestyles. The imposition of European political and legal systems replaced traditional Polynesian governance structures with institutions designed to serve colonial interests rather than indigenous needs. Colonial administrators, operating with limited understanding of traditional Polynesian political organisation, established centralised bureaucracies that concentrated power in colonial capitals while marginalising traditional chiefs and community leaders. These new political systems emphasised individual rights and responsibilities rather than collective obligations, undermining the social solidarity that had enabled Polynesian communities to thrive in challenging island environments. European legal codes, imposed throughout Polynesian territories during the 19th century, criminalised traditional practices while establishing new categories of prohibited behaviour that reflected European rather than indigenous values. Traditional forms of conflict resolution, based on restoration of social harmony through compensation and ritual reconciliation, were replaced by punitive justice systems that emphasised punishment rather than community healing. These legal changes eliminated traditional mechanisms for maintaining social order while creating new forms of social control that served colonial rather than indigenous interests. The introduction of European economic systems based on wage labour, private property and market exchange fundamentally altered traditional Polynesian relationships between people and resources. Traditional subsistence economies that had sustained Polynesian communities for over a millennium were gradually replaced by cash economies that required participation in colonial labour markets and dependence on imported goods. These economic changes eliminated the self-sufficiency that had enabled Polynesian communities to maintain their independence, while creating new forms of dependency that served colonial economic interests. Colonial taxation systems imposed new financial obligations on Polynesian populations, while providing few benefits that served indigenous interests. Tax requirements forced Polynesian communities to participate in cash economies, even when traditional subsistence systems could adequately meet their needs, creating artificial scarcity and dependency relationships that benefited colonial administrators and European merchants. The inability to pay colonial taxes often resulted in land confiscation or forced labour that further undermined traditional economic systems and social organisation. The disruption of traditional trade networks that had connected Polynesian communities across vast ocean distances eliminated important sources of goods, ideas and social connections that had sustained inter-island relationships for centuries. Colonial authorities, seeking to control commercial activities and extract maximum profit from Pacific trade, prohibited or heavily regulated traditional voyaging and exchange relationships while establishing new commercial networks that served European rather than indigenous interests. These changes isolated Polynesian communities from each other, while increasing their dependence on colonial economic systems and European manufactured goods. The devastating colonial disruption that had shattered traditional Polynesian societies and nearly obliterated centuries of accumulated cultural knowledge would eventually provoke a powerful counter-movement as 20th century Polynesian communities began asserting their right to cultural survival and political self-determination. This renaissance emerged gradually through the efforts of dedicated individuals who recognised that their ancestral traditions contained invaluable knowledge systems and cultural practices that could provide foundations for modern Polynesian identity, while addressing contemporary challenges facing island communities throughout the Pacific. The revival of traditional navigation represented one of the most dramatic and symbolically powerful aspects of this cultural renaissance. By the early 20th century, the sophisticated wayfinding techniques that had enabled Polynesian expansion across the Pacific had virtually disappeared from most island communities, surviving only among a handful of elderly practitioners in remote areas of Micronesia and scattered locations throughout Polynesia. The rediscovery and revitalization of these navigation systems began through the pioneering work of individuals like David Lewis, who in the 1960s documented surviving traditional navigation knowledge in the Caroline Islands and demonstrated that ancient wayfinding techniques remained viable for modern ocean voyaging. The establishment of the Polynesian Voyaging Society in Hawaii in 1973 marked a crucial turning point in navigation revival efforts, as this organisation committed to reconstructing traditional voyaging canoes and training new generations of navigators using ancient techniques. The construction of hokulea, a traditional double-hulled voyaging canoe built using archaeological evidence and ethnographic accounts of ancient watercraft, represented an extraordinary achievement that required coordination between master craftsmen, cultural specialists, and modern engineers working to recreate technologies that had been abandoned for over a century. The successful voyage of hokulea from Hawaii to Tahiti in 1976, guided entirely by traditional navigation methods under the direction of Micronesian navigator Nainoa Thompson, demonstrated conclusively that ancient Polynesian wayfinding techniques could achieve the precision necessary for long-distance Pacific voyaging. This voyage, covering over 4,000 kilometres of open ocean without instruments, proved that Polynesian ancestors had possessed sophisticated navigation capabilities, rather than having stumbled upon Pacific islands through accidental drift voyages, as some Western scholars had suggested. The impact of Hokulea's successful voyage extended far beyond proving the viability of traditional navigation techniques. For Polynesian communities throughout the Pacific, this achievement provided powerful evidence of their ancestors' remarkable capabilities and sophisticated cultural achievements, countering centuries of colonial propaganda that had portrayed indigenous Pacific Islanders as primitive peoples, lacking advanced knowledge or technical skills. The voyage inspired similar projects throughout Polynesia, with communities in Tahiti, New Zealand, Samoa, and other island groups beginning their own traditional navigation revival programs. Nainoa Thompson's development as a traditional navigator represented a crucial bridge between ancient knowledge systems and contemporary cultural revival efforts. Working under the guidance of Micronesian master navigator Pius Pielug, Thompson learned to read star positions, ocean swells, and weather patterns using techniques that had been refined over centuries of Pacific voyaging. His successful completion of multiple trans-Pacific voyages using only traditional methods established him as a master navigator while demonstrating that ancient knowledge systems could be transmitted to new practitioners through dedicated training programs. The expansion of traditional navigation training programs throughout Polynesia created networks of cultural exchange and knowledge sharing that reconnected island communities that had been isolated from each other during the colonial period. Young people from Hawaii, Tahiti, New Zealand, and other Polynesian territories participated in voyaging expeditions that exposed them to traditional knowledge systems while building cultural connections across political boundaries established by colonial powers. These programs provided practical education in traditional skills while fostering pride in Polynesian cultural heritage and identity. Language preservation efforts represented another crucial component of the 20th century Polynesian cultural renaissance, as communities recognised that their indigenous languages contained irreplaceable repositories of traditional knowledge and cultural understanding. By the mid-20th century, most Polynesian languages faced severe decline as colonial education systems had successfully discouraged their use while promoting European languages as essential for economic advancement and social mobility. The recognition that language loss threatened the survival of traditional knowledge systems motivated comprehensive revitalization programs throughout Polynesian communities. The Hawaiian language revitalization movement, beginning in earnest during the 1970s, demonstrated how coordinated community efforts could reverse language decline and restore indigenous languages to active use in contemporary settings. The establishment of Hawaiian language immersion schools, known as Punana Leo, provided educational environments where children could develop fluency in Hawaiian while receiving instruction in traditional cultural knowledge and contemporary academic subjects. These programs proved that indigenous languages could serve as effective vehicles for modern education while preserving cultural knowledge that was embedded in traditional linguistic structures. Maori language revitalisation in New Zealand followed similar principles but operated on a larger scale due to New Zealand's substantial indigenous population and relatively strong political position of Maori communities within the modern state. The establishment of Maori language immersion schools, known as Kura Kaupapa Maori, create educational pathways that enabled Maori children to develop fluency in their ancestral language while receiving comprehensive education that prepared them for success in contemporary New Zealand society. These programs demonstrated that Indigenous language education could produce graduates who were both culturally grounded and academically competitive. The development of Indigenous language broadcasting and media programs provided additional support for language revitalisation efforts while creating new contexts for traditional knowledge transmission. Radio and television programs conducted entirely in Polynesian languages expose community members to their ancestral languages while providing information about traditional cultural practices, contemporary political issues, and community events. These media programs proved particularly effective for reaching adult community members who had limited opportunities for formal language education, but wanted to reconnect with their cultural heritage. University-level programs in Polynesian languages and cultural studies created institutional support for advanced language preservation and cultural research while training new generations of cultural specialists and educators. The establishment of Hawaiian studies programs at the University of Hawaii and Maori studies programs at New Zealand universities provided academic frameworks for systematic investigation of traditional knowledge systems while creating career pathways for individuals committed to cultural preservation and revitalization. These programs produced scholars who combined traditional cultural knowledge with modern research methods to document and preserve endangered cultural practices. The revival of traditional cultural practices extended beyond navigation and language to encompass virtually every aspect of Polynesian cultural expression, from traditional arts and crafts to ceremonial protocols and spiritual practices. Master craftsmen who had maintained traditional skills during the colonial period began accepting apprentices and establishing formal training programs that could transmit specialized knowledge to new generations of practitioners. These revival efforts often required extensive research to reconstruct techniques and knowledge systems that had been disrupted by colonial suppression, while adapting traditional practices to contemporary contexts and available materials. Traditional carving revival programs throughout Polynesia combined archaeological evidence, ethnographic documentation, and surviving oral traditions to reconstruct ancient artistic techniques and design systems. Master carvers worked with cultural specialists and community elders to identify appropriate wood species, reconstruct traditional tools, and relearn carving techniques that had been abandoned for generations. These programs produced new generations of skilled carvers while creating contemporary artworks that maintained connections to ancestral traditions while addressing modern cultural needs and artistic expressions. The revival of traditional tattooing practices represented one of the most visible and personally meaningful aspects of Polynesian cultural renaissance, as individuals chose to mark their bodies with traditional designs that proclaimed their cultural identity and connection to ancestral traditions. Master tattoo artists like Paulo Suluape in Samoa and others throughout Polynesia began accepting apprentices and establishing formal training programs that transmitted traditional tattooing knowledge while adapting ancient techniques to modern equipment and safety standards. These programs enabled young Polynesians to receive traditional tattoos that connected them to their cultural heritage while participating in contemporary artistic traditions. Traditional dance and music revival programs created opportunities for community members to learn ancestral performance traditions while providing context for cultural expression and community celebration. Dance schools throughout Polynesia began offering instruction in traditional choreography, music and costume construction, while organising performances that showcased traditional cultural knowledge for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous audiences. These programs proved particularly effective for engaging young people in cultural learning, while creating social contexts that reinforced community identity and cultural pride. The political movements toward independence and self-determination that emerged throughout Polynesian territories during the 20th century reflected growing awareness that cultural survival required political autonomy and control over traditional territories and resources. Western Samoa's achievement of independence in 1962 marked the first successful Polynesian independence movement and provided inspiration for similar efforts throughout the Pacific. The Samoan independence process demonstrated that Polynesian communities could successfully navigate the transition from colonial administration to self-governance while maintaining their cultural identity and traditional political institutions. The establishment of the independent state of Samoa required careful integration of traditional Samoan political institutions with modern governmental structures necessary for international recognition and effective administration. The Matai system of traditional chiefs was incorporated into the new national government, with the whānau serving as the national legislature while maintaining its traditional role as a council of family representatives. This integration demonstrated that traditional Polynesian political systems could provide foundations for modern governance, while preserving cultural continuity and community-based decision-making processes. Tonga's maintenance of formal independence throughout the colonial period, while still experiencing significant European influence, provided a different model for Polynesian political development that emphasised the adaptation of traditional monarchical institutions to modern governmental requirements. The Tongan political system combined traditional chiefly authority with constitutional monarchy structures that enable the kingdom to maintain its sovereignty while participating in international political and economic systems. This approach demonstrated that traditional Polynesian political institutions possess sufficient flexibility to evolve with changing circumstances while maintaining their essential cultural characteristics. French Polynesia's ongoing struggle for greater autonomy from France reflected the complex challenges facing Polynesian territories that remained under colonial administration despite growing international support for decolonisation. The independence movement in French Polynesia, led by political parties advocating for Polynesian self-determination, faced significant obstacles including French economic control, military presence, and political manipulation designed to maintain colonial relationships. The persistence of these independence efforts despite French resistance demonstrated the strength of Polynesian political consciousness and commitment to self-determination. The development of indigenous rights movements throughout Polynesian territories created networks of political cooperation and mutual support that transcended colonial boundaries while advocating for recognition of traditional land rights, cultural preservation, and political autonomy. These movements drew inspiration from international indigenous rights advocacy, while developing specifically Polynesian approaches to political organisation and cultural preservation that reflected traditional values and contemporary political realities. New Zealand's Treaty of Waitangi settlement process, beginning in earnest during the 1970s, provided a framework for addressing historical injustices while recognising Maori rights to traditional territories and cultural preservation. The Waitangi Tribunal, established to investigate Maori, claims regarding treaty violations created legal mechanisms for redressing colonial land confiscation and cultural suppression, while providing foundations for ongoing Maori political participation in New Zealand governance. This process demonstrated that colonial settler states could acknowledge historical injustices while creating frameworks for indigenous political participation and cultural preservation. Hawaiian sovereignty movements developed multiple approaches to achieving greater political autonomy, ranging from demands for complete independence to proposals for nation-within-a-nation status that would provide Hawaiian political control over traditional territories while maintaining relationships with the United States. These movements drew upon traditional Hawaiian political concepts while engaging with contemporary legal and political frameworks to advance Hawaiian self-determination. The diversity of approaches within Hawaiian sovereignty movements reflected both the complexity of Hawaiian political circumstances and the strength of Hawaiian commitment to regaining control over their ancestral homeland. The modern Polynesian diaspora, created by economic migration and educational opportunities in metropolitan centres, faced unique challenges in maintaining cultural identity while adapting to urban environments that provided few supports for traditional cultural practices. Polynesian communities in cities like Auckland, Los Angeles and Sydney developed innovative approaches to cultural preservation that adapted traditional practices to urban contexts, while creating new forms of cultural expression that reflected contemporary Polynesian experiences. Urban Polynesian communities established cultural centres, language schools, and performance groups that provided context for cultural learning and expression, while serving as focal points for community organisation and mutual support. These institutions often combine traditional cultural activities with contemporary social services, providing assistance with housing, employment and education, while maintaining connections to ancestral traditions and island communities. The success of these urban cultural institutions demonstrated the adaptability of Polynesian cultural traditions and their continued relevance for contemporary community needs. The development of pan-Polynesian cultural movements in diaspora communities created new forms of cultural identity that transcended traditional island boundaries while celebrating shared Polynesian heritage. Cultural festivals, educational programs, and political organisations brought together Polynesians from different island groups to celebrate common cultural traditions while advocating for shared political interests. These pan-Polynesian movements created new opportunities for cultural exchange and political cooperation, while maintaining respect for distinct island traditions and identities. Contemporary challenges facing Polynesian communities include the existential threat posed by climate change to low-lying islands and atolls throughout the Pacific. Rising sea levels, increased storm intensity and changing rainfall patterns threaten the physical survival of many Polynesian communities while undermining traditional subsistence systems and cultural practices tied to specific island environments. The potential displacement of entire populations from uninhabitable islands represents an unprecedented challenge that requires innovative approaches to cultural preservation and community survival. Climate change adaptation strategies developed by Polynesian communities combine traditional environmental knowledge with contemporary scientific understanding to develop sustainable responses to changing environmental conditions. Traditional agricultural techniques, water management systems, and seasonal calendars provide foundations for adaptation strategies, while modern technology and international cooperation offer additional resources for community resilience. These adaptation efforts demonstrate the continued relevance of traditional knowledge systems while highlighting the need for integration with contemporary scientific approaches. The challenge of maintaining cultural authenticity while participating in globalized economic and social systems requires careful balance between cultural preservation and necessary adaptation to contemporary realities. Polynesian communities must navigate between maintaining traditional practices and values while acquiring the skills and resources necessary for success in modern economies. This balance requires ongoing negotiation and adaptation as communities work to preserve essential cultural elements while embracing beneficial aspects of globalization. Cultural tourism, while providing economic opportunities for many Polynesian communities, creates challenges related to the commodification of traditional practices and the presentation of cultural traditions for external consumption. Communities must develop approaches to cultural tourism that provide economic benefits while maintaining the integrity and spiritual significance of traditional practices. This requires careful management of tourist interactions with cultural sites and ceremonies while ensuring that tourism development serves community interests rather than external commercial exploitation. The preservation of traditional ecological knowledge represents a crucial challenge as environmental changes and economic development threaten the ecosystems that supported traditional Polynesian subsistence systems. Traditional knowledge about marine ecosystems, agricultural practices, and resource management contains invaluable information for sustainable development while providing foundations for cultural identity and community organisation. The documentation and transmission of this knowledge requires urgent attention as elderly practitioners pass away and environmental changes eliminate traditional learning contexts. The integration of traditional knowledge systems with contemporary education and research institutions creates opportunities for preserving Indigenous knowledge while demonstrating its relevance for addressing modern challenges. University research programs, environmental management agencies, and educational institutions increasingly recognise the value of traditional Polynesian knowledge for understanding Pacific ecosystems and developing sustainable resource management strategies. These collaborations provide new contexts for knowledge preservation, while creating career opportunities for young Polynesians interested in combining traditional knowledge with contemporary professional skills. The digital revolution has created new opportunities and challenges for Polynesian cultural preservation and transmission. Online platforms enable global communication between Polynesian communities while providing new venues for language learning, cultural education, and artistic expression. However, digital technologies also threaten traditional forms of cultural transmission that require face-to-face interaction and hands-on learning experiences. Polynesian communities must develop strategies for utilising digital technologies to support cultural preservation while maintaining essential elements of traditional knowledge transmission. Social media platforms have become important venues for Polynesian cultural expression and community organisation, enabling diaspora communities to maintain connections with island homelands while sharing cultural knowledge and experiences across vast distances. These digital connections create new forms of community that transcend geographical boundaries while providing platforms for cultural advocacy and political organisation. However, social media also creates risks related to cultural appropriation and misrepresentation that require careful community management and education. The revitalisation of traditional governance systems within contemporary political frameworks represents an ongoing challenge that requires creative integration of ancestral political institutions with modern governmental requirements. Polynesian communities throughout the Pacific are developing innovative approaches to governance that incorporate traditional decision-making processes, leadership selection methods, and community organisation principles while meeting contemporary administrative and legal requirements. These efforts demonstrate the continued relevance of traditional political systems while highlighting the need for adaptive governance structures that serve contemporary community needs. The role of women in contemporary Polynesian cultural revival movements reflects both traditional gender roles and modern opportunities for leadership and cultural preservation. Women have played crucial roles in language revitalisation, traditional arts revival, and cultural education, while advocating for recognition of women's traditional authority and contributions to Polynesian societies. These efforts challenge colonial-imposed restrictions on women's roles while drawing upon traditional foundations for women's leadership and cultural expertise. Youth engagement in cultural preservation represents both a crucial opportunity and significant challenge for contemporary Polynesian communities. Young people possess the energy and adaptability necessary for cultural innovation, while facing pressures to pursue economic opportunities that may require abandoning traditional cultural practices. Successful cultural preservation programs must provide meaningful roles for young people while demonstrating the continued relevance of traditional knowledge and practices for contemporary success and fulfillment. The development of indigenous research methodologies that incorporate traditional knowledge systems with contemporary academic standards creates new opportunities for Polynesian scholars to investigate their own cultural traditions while contributing to international academic discourse. These research approaches challenge Western academic assumptions while providing frameworks for systematic investigation of traditional knowledge that respects indigenous cultural protocols and community ownership of cultural information. Contemporary Polynesian artistic expression combines traditional cultural elements with modern artistic techniques and global cultural influences to create new forms of cultural expression that reflect contemporary Polynesian experiences while maintaining connections to ancestral traditions. These artistic innovations demonstrate the continued vitality and adaptability of Polynesian cultural traditions, while providing new venues for cultural expression and identity formation. The establishment of cultural intellectual property rights represents an important development in protecting traditional Polynesian knowledge and cultural expressions from inappropriate commercial exploitation while ensuring that communities retain control over their cultural heritage. These legal frameworks provide mechanisms for preventing cultural appropriation while enabling appropriate sharing of traditional knowledge for educational and cultural preservation purposes. As Polynesian communities continue to navigate the challenges of cultural preservation and adaptation in the 21st century, they draw upon the same qualities of innovation, resilience, and cultural pride that enabled their ancestors to successfully colonize the vast Pacific Ocean over a millennium ago. The contemporary Polynesian Renaissance demonstrates that traditional cultural systems possess the flexibility and strength necessary for survival and adaptation, while providing foundations for addressing modern challenges and opportunities. The success of cultural revitalization efforts throughout Polynesia offers hope that these remarkable civilizations will continue to thrive while maintaining their distinctive identities and contributing their unique perspectives to an increasingly interconnected world. The story of the Polynesians, from their origins in the Lapita culture through their remarkable expansion across the Pacific to their contemporary cultural renaissance, represents one of humanity's most extraordinary achievements in maritime exploration, cultural adaptation, and civilizational resilience. Their legacy continues to inspire and inform contemporary understanding of human capability, cultural diversity, and the enduring power of traditional knowledge systems to provide foundations for addressing modern challenges while maintaining distinctive cultural identities in an increasingly globalized world.